Hi, folks. Layman Pascal here. A while back we did an attitudinal hangout with square peggers Jason and Scout, which maybe would be best described as an undirected, uninhibited dredging of the muck under the integral lake of sexuality, psyche, and society. It was fun and casual and anarchic and touched very personally on a lot of pertinent topics to multidimensional health, development, and the attitudes that might make us relatively free and robust in the complex, confused, oddly conformist, and strangely fragile social environment in which we find ourselves these days. So when they asked to do it again and talk about ethnicity, gender, and human typology, I thought, why not? Let's squander whatever little bit of good reputation and professionalism I have left and go traipsing through the trialogue swamp. So Scout, Jason, hi, you ready to traipse?
I'm ready to traipse. And also frolic. We should frolic as well.
Let's definitely frolic.
Frolic.
If you're good, I might throw in a prance.
We'll frolic very slowly through the quicksand content. Tiptoe through the quicksand. Anyway.
So what are we going to talk about? Oh, wait, before we do anything, you posted a picture of Kip Dynamite from Napoleon Dynamite in the group chat.
Yes.
The skinny guy with the mustache. And it was the exact same night we watched Napoleon Dynamite with the kids. They hadn't seen it.
It's a rite of passage.
Shot
totally.
Of Napoleon standing in the yard waiting for the bus, and he's got this weird hunch. And the boy, he's, I think, 12. And he immediately goes, I immediately know I'm going to love this movie just from the posture.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, touching in on that, what are we going to talk about?
It's a fantastic movie. I think it was also the first movie that MTV Studios put out. It was actually their first movie.
Wow.
Okay, shout out to MTV Studios.
With
cultural historian Jason McClain.
In the last 20 years. MTV, they've been around for what, 40 years? Thanks for 12 years of good music. That's the joke. Yeah, I just thought I thought it'd be great for this group in particular to talk about gender, talk about ethnicity, because there's only one race, right? There's just the human race, which has sort of got lost. And as it relates to stages, I had run across an iconograph, a chart, a few weeks ago, which I spent 2 hours trying to find last night. That in America, which ethnicity, what percentage of that ethnicity relates to themselves as that? So, for instance, of Black people, what percentage of them identify as Black, like with their race? And I thought it was really interesting because I couldn't find it, I'm making these numbers up. So this is like the general, like my general sense of it was something like, over 70% of Black people identified as Black. Asian and Hispanic were somewhere around 50 or 60%. And the white people were around like 30%. Like it was, and again, I don't know about the exact numbers, but that was the kind of breakdown it was. And I just thought it was fascinating because, the ultimate spiritual practice is disidentifying from that which you think is you, including your ethnicity, your political affiliation, your possessions, your body, all of those things, not to disidentify, not dissociate, but disidentify from them, because to the degree that you're identified with them, your reputation, I knew, or your vocation. I knew a Catholic priest he'd been a priest his whole life. And before he was a priest, he was in like youth ministries. And his ability to deliver mass was taken away in the United States. He could travel to other countries and deliver mass, but he was not allowed to in the United States. And he was deeply suicidal for a period of time because to him, that was who he was. Like he was deeply identified with his role in this particular church for that long, doing this particular thing. Because, and of course, if that's who he was, he didn't commit suicide, by the way. I bumped into him that was 10 years ago. I bumped into him about a year ago. And he's, still at the same church. So he, took on, he could have left, but he didn't. And but just the reason he was suicidal was because something he was deeply identified with was taken away from him. And so he, went into a state of despair. Like, who am I really? It can happen with money. It can, like, if you're identified with your credit score, or if you're, and I think it causes different kinds of problems in America, at least, where people are, seemingly deeply identified with their ethnicity. And I didn't realize how those who do identify with white as their race, the last year has shown me that they're much more serious about it than I thought they might be. Fundamentalists, I would say. So, that's the one of the thoughts I have. And really, the whole reason to do whatever we're doing is to help people be more free. So I think it's a place where people get, they just get caught up.
It seems like there's an idealistic spiritual attitude of, like, I want to be completely disidentified with all forms, but there's also a really basic sense of, just in practical terms, not wanting to be fragile, right? You're talking about this guy becoming suicidal, right? That the robustness and resilience of his ability to live his life is compromised by the uninspected degree to which he's identified with a role that he's playing.
Right.
But then there's this question about, like, how do we identify with roles in order to become transparent to them, in order to disidentify with them, but not reject them? Because I think a lot of people who seem to have good disidentification and good integrity, it's because they kind of know who they are and they know what their roles are. And some of those things we can find by introspection, but some of those things we find by, like, oh, these are groups and heritages in which I appear to be clustered. And if I reject those, I might not get to the point where I can live them in a disidentified fashion.
Yeah, I think rejecting them is not, I think that's a regression or a bypass, to use an overused term. I don't think that's authentic disidentification. I think you have to move through identifying with it first. And often, the only time you really know if you're identified with something is if you experience extreme anxiety, if it's threatened to be taken away, or, fear, anxiety, or grief and despair, if it is in fact taken away.
What do you think, Scout? How do we own our identities in a way that allows us to disidentify from them in the right way?
Thank you for asking that, because I have a lot of hypotheses around this, partially having to do with my personal experience as a Black woman who was sort of never really identified with the sort of the cultural narrative of what it means to be Black and what it means to be a woman. I've never identified with either of those, not because they didn't resonate with my experience, but because of so narrative has to do with tribe, and tribe has to do with survival. This is my hypothesis. So we have narratives, we have mythologies, and we need them because we associate them with survival in some sense. So, like, in order, like, having a shared narrative and having an individual narrative are both sort of necessary, I feel like, for a lot of people's mental health. And this is where I start to bring, like, video game and, like, RPG metaphors into it. And this seems to resonate for a lot of people who are struggling with identity. Like, I was talking to a friend not even like 15 minutes ago about this, about how, like, so what's so great about RPG is that, like, you're not that person, but you get to play that role, and you have to define your character in order to play the game. And that's true of life as well. Like, if you conceptualize of your reality as a game, you need to define your character. You need to give your character a race and a class and you need to give them a story in order to move through the reality. That's true of real life as well as of any game that you're playing, unless it's like chess, which I find chess to be incredibly boring. But there is something about our reality that we need to define it in order to move through it. And we're a part of that reality. And so, but at the same time, like, this cup is only like a cup because like I need it in order, like, it serves a function. And in order for it to serve a function, I need to know what it is and what it does. If I was like, I don't know what this is, I don't know what it's called, I don't know what it's for, it's not useful to me. So I think that having an awareness that like we define things not because they are what we say they are, but because we need them to be something in order to take the next step is sort of necessary. It provides sort of like a layer of detachment without completely dismissing the sort of like natural categorical way that humans think. Like, why do we think categorically? I think is the question that needs to be answered in order for people to get their heads out of their asses, for lack of a better term.
I think it's important. And, most people who are watching this probably are aware of integral theory, but for those who aren't, I think it's really important to bring up just the basic 3 stages of ego development: pre-rational, rational, and transrational. Or egocentric, me against the world, and ethnocentric or nationalistic, me and my people, me and my tribe against the world. And then, world-centric, transrational, we're all in this together. And, I think it's like the way people relate to those things, whether it's the cup or themselves, it just reveals. It doesn't give it, but it reveals what stage of ego development they're at, where they respond to emotionally, or from emotionally, and how they interpret events. That's the reason it's so important. And I know that's really basic stuff, but I think it's worth repeating pretty much every time I do a thing. I'm like, these are the basic things that are really important. And I was watching, I don't know if you guys are familiar with, do you know who Scotty Pippen is?
Some kind of sports guy from a while.
Yeah. Do you know who Michael Jordan is?
Yeah. He was a basketball player that my dad watched in the 90s.
So
was that the first guy in space? First guy in space, right? No,
he was the first black man in America.
I'm close, right?
He could really jump.
He was the first black man ever.
That's
he
right.
Was ham.
Was he the first black man, Jason?
Yes, he was. God. We should cut that part out.
No, we shouldn't.
That's right.
I'll be damned if we do.
I'm just imagining Michael Jordan jumping for a basket and just like continuing into space. He's that good.
He
jumped for your sins, Layman. Okay.
So Scotty Pippen is one of the top 50, according to the NBA, like the top 50 basketball players in history. He played on all the same teams as Michael Jordan. Imagine being like in the 50 all-time greatest basketball players, and nobody knows who you are, and you played on the same team that won 6 championships, all 6 with Michael Jordan, right? So Michael Jordan recently put out a documentary, or I think he produced it himself, but ESPN, called The Last Dance, and a lot of it was about some of the dysfunction that was going on with that last championship team. Scotty Pippen recently came, and he played 1 year without Michael because Michael retired briefly to go play baseball. Wasn't very good, so he came back to basketball. And Scotty Pippen came out last week and basically said that there was and he had like 1 year to shine without Michael, right? And when they drew up the last play in a game that was in either the finals or the semifinals, Phil Jackson, the coach that coached them to all those championships, also coached Kobe Bryant and Shaq to championships, has everybody read Zen books, things like that. And he held all these personalities together. Scotty came out and said that the reason he gave the last, drew up a play for the guy to take the last shot was because it was racial. It's because the guy was white, right? Now, first of all, the guy made the shot. Second of all, a lot of people might have been expecting Scotty to take the shot. So you want a decoy, it's a smarter move, and they won the game. So it was the right move. And Scotty doubled down. He went on the Dan Patrick show and said, yeah, I don't have a problem calling him a racist. Phil Jackson, probably one of the greatest basketball coaches of all time. You know, he won 9 championships. Now, nobody has got Scotty's back on this. They're like, well, what? Like, but he did the same thing when Jordan was on the team with Steve Kerr, who was white. Like, Steve Kerr took the last shot. And Scotty's like, yeah, I don't have a problem calling him a racist. There is not a single basketball player, like, and I've been watching a lot of them come on and they're asked about, what do you think about Scotty? And they're like, I feel sorry for him. And I think he just, like, the fact that he interpreted it as it must have been racist rather than it's the best move to win the game, and yeah, I get it. He wanted to take the last shot, but it should be about winning the championship. It should be a transpersonal experience. Like, we're a team. What's important, that I take the last shot or that we win the championship? Right. And it's just like, it's sad for me to watch people go around going, well, it's because I'm black, when obviously in that situation it wasn't, or there would be at least one other person going, yeah, Phil was kind of a racist, right? Like, you don't get to coach for 25 years and not have that revealed somewhere somehow, right? Like, there would have been at least one other instance, and it's like, well, it just wasn't, and here's the thing: Scotty actually quit on the team in the last 1.8 seconds, which I don't know if you know anything. If you've ever watched the end of a basketball game, 1.8 seconds could be, multiple points back and forth. But Scotty refused to go back in, and that's the thing that he's remembered for in Chicago with those Bulls teams. And it's just unfortunate that 20 years later, he still thinks it's because he was black. And that's the thing I see happen a lot. Now, I've also been stunned at how racist, like, I grew up on the West Coast. I was blissfully unaware of how racist a lot of our country is. And I looked at, the last electoral map in virtually all the states, except for one or two variants, all the states that voted for slavery have all voted red, and the ones that were, not in the Union, all voted blue. Or not in the Confederacy or voted against slavery. We're still voting along those lines, 150 years later. But still, even still, I think the mindset is unfortunate. Like, Scotty, to live in, I can't imagine to live in the world of, like, well, and of course people project stuff onto me because of whatever, my hair. But, again, the whole purpose of this is just to look at how people, like, where people are at, me against the world, me and my people against the world, or we're all in this together. And I think if we're going to get anywhere in this country, we're going to have to be like, we're all in this together. Like, what's best for all of us?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's important to talk about weaponization if we're going to go for we're all in this together.
Say more about that.
Sure. So, when you talked about, when you briefly brought up the whole, like, it's because I'm insert marginalized group name here. So it's really important to differentiate, like, first of all, it's really important to address that as, like, from the perspective of empathizing with, say, a social justice, someone who identifies with that. The ultimate intention of social justice is relatively, I think, necessary to sort of be, like, to recognize people, like, okay, so yeah, despite, like, our differences, we share a planet, and that planet is arguably in a lot of danger right now, and it's experiencing a lot of chaos. So, like, and it affects all of us to differing degrees, but it still affects all of us. So, like, we have to have an awareness of the fact that we do share the planet, and so that's the we're all in this together piece. And then there's also the necessary sort of differentiation and the how do I put this? So I think that there's a positive way to sort of experience ethnocentrism as long as it doesn't take precedence over, like, a more world-centric perspective. So it's like the whole holarchy thing of, like, there would be no world-centric without healthy, the ethnocentric sort of, like, has to have a stable foundation first before the world-centrism can even manifest in people's awareness. Yeah. So the reason why I bring weaponization into this is because you have genuine, we're all in this together, and then you have we're all in this together as like a platitude. You have, oh, it's because I'm Black, as being weaponized as like a way to gain egocentric sort of like attention and status as a victim. And then you have people actually trying to address certain racial disparities in our culture that actually exist. And because of the weaponization of these sort of tactics, people tend to take them in general less seriously. And that's a huge problem that I see, is like, how do we, another question I guess I have is like, how do we discern when someone's genuinely trying to address an issue or when they're being manipulative, you know?
Right. When they're hijacking the values of a higher stage for lower stage purposes.
Yeah, and that's where we have to look at other things in their lives. We have to look beyond, in particular, beyond the contents of statements, I think. Right? Like, of course, all lives matter. Well, is that person saying that from an ethnocentric point of view where they're secretly privileging one group over another? Or are they saying it from a world-centric point of view, which really does take a kind of moral precedence over any particular identity groups? Or from a really complicated, paradoxical vision point of view where the particular is how you show up as the universal? So we just don't know from the content of any given statement or from the public presentation of any given act. So you've got to, unless you're cross-referencing it to a lot of other dimensions of that person, you really have no idea where it's coming from.
Yeah, I was fond of saying all lives matter until I realized who else was saying it. And I was like, no, that's a distance. I was like, oh, God, far like white supremacists are saying it. I was like, oh, great. Or the police were saying it, or, after, without taking any responsibility for the fact that, and, I think we should probably talk like there's I forget his first name. Andre Bowman, I think, started an organization that's like, hey, beyond protest, like, here are some things you can do to, that's not his first name. He was NFL Man of the Year twice, played for the 49ers as a wide receiver, which is why I know about him. But, great guy. But he started an organization that's like, here's how to vote to end, like, if we end qualified immunity, which no other country has, I don't think, in the what we would call, like in the EU or, in the Western world. So EU, NATO countries, let's say, I don't think any of them have qualified immunity in what we would consider advanced societies. We need to end that, which if people don't know what that is, they should. It's basically cops can do whatever they want, which is why they keep their jobs. We should have a national, educating people about what their rights are when they get stopped. Like, they have all these initiatives, like here, and specific ways you can get involved. And I think that's important. There are, and people can talk all they want about cops, but there are structural problems. There are policy problems. There are laws that keep these guys in place, or girls. In Seattle, she was like 5'2", this cop. She just freaked out and maced somebody walking across the street who wasn't doing anything. She just like flipped out. So they didn't even suspend her. They settled with the person. The person wasn't even protesting. They were just in their crosswalk. And so, she might have been put on leave for a few days, but I think we actually need to make it easier to fire them. So I don't want to step over any of that. And while the numbers, I think about 10 years ago, I looked at the FBI numbers, and more Black people per capita were experiencing physical violence from police, but more white people were having fatal encounters with them. That is no longer the case. That was a decade ago. The numbers have definitely shifted. And the FBI's also, they have white supremacists in police as one of their number one priorities, and they have for a while. Like, they've been looking at it for a while. And I don't think we can ignore that. And unfortunately, we've had, politicians really play to it, and, selling to the lizard brain lately. And it's not, what's true or what's accurate, but what will trigger someone the most, activate them emotionally. And they've gotten very good at it. It doesn't even matter what's real anymore. So I think these are all very complex issues. you know, I think what, to Scout's point, you know, it is transcend and include, not transcend and deny or suppress.
Yep.
And we have to get people to move through those stages wherever they're at. You can't skip over them. So,
yeah, I think
this
that's
sort of
key because they're sorry. You know, like you were saying about Scotty Pippen, you know, or, you know, is it because I'm black? Well, maybe, but not necessarily. And that's a kind of as if pluralistic interpretation thinking that requires a certain level of development. So one of the things that would really help is having people be able to stably access possibilities without necessarily doubling down on those as realities, because it could be, but it might not be. And that's true of almost every circumstance. So they have to be open situations for inquiry rather than situations in which we take an adamant stance one way or the other.
Yeah. And I think Scotty's just hurting. Like, he was basically left out of the documentary, you know, like Jordan did what Jordan does. And it was about, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like, he's a fanatic, you know. They called Kobe Black Mamba for a reason. He always went in for the kill, you know, in a game. Like, there's a certain mindset of a champion that they're gonna be that way. And, you know, it's sort of things that we try to get children not to do. Is the things we want in champion, like it's the things you need in championship athletes. Scotty also is trying to sell a new bourbon and putting a book out. So, but it seemed like I watched the interview of him and I watched it a couple of times. He seems like he really believes it. He's not just doing it for headlines or clicks. Like, that's his world. And that's okay. I just think there's other possible interpretations, and, you know, and the people he even threw some shade on Michael. And you know, it's funny. The only thing I remember from Scottie Pippen is him throwing a chair across the floor during a game because he was frustrated because they weren't winning. And it was that year without Michael. Anyway, I think he's still hurting from something 20 years ago. He says he's over, but clearly he's not.
I feel like I cut you off a couple of minutes ago, Scout. Is there something you want to circle back to?
Great question, Layman. I forgot.
Well, you know, I had some thoughts about,
which is something that you can always rely on me for.
Your idea about cups and narratives and usefulness was intriguing to me.
Right.
And
okay.
So in terms of integral type developmental stages, in a simple sense, right, we get to this point where it is really useful to engage with others around narratives that in part make us useful to others. But then we have to sort of grow beyond and critique that, but start to sift through them and see what kinds of narratives would actually be most useful. Like, who do I want to be useful to and for what use? Rather than just accepting an identity that turns out makes me very useful to some particular subset of the species.
Yeah. And this actually reminds me a lot of like some sort of more obscure political, like leftist ideology, like that I don't know a ton about, but I'm like delving into and sort of trying to synthesize and understand more deeply. And it's like the concept of like the exploitation aspects of our current like iteration of capitalism. And, you know, there's tons of theory in having to do with, you know, all of these things, but there's this one particular facet. And like, you know, from an integral perspective, we would focus on it more as like, oh, this is an aspect of like modernism, not necessarily capitalism, but like from that sort of faction of leftism, it's an aspect of capitalism. So wanting to speak to both sides of that, but who are you useful to is a really important question here, I think, when it comes to this idea of exploitation, because like you can be useful to like someone in an exploitative sense, and that particularly comes into play in terms of our, like, I think modernism, we tend to identify with what we do and what we achieve. When we have more modernist values, it's like there's a sense of needing to prove something, and that's easily exploitable in the context of a very material centric society. Like, oh, well, if you do this thing, then everyone will love you. But like the sort of like catch to that is that like you got to make me a bunch of money first or whatever. So there's that is something that comes to mind, and not sure how related it was to what you said, but it came to mind.
I think the idea of capitalism and modernism in all of this is interesting because there's a sense in which ethnocentric identities or analogs to ethnocentric identities as well are really useful to the modernist structure that's been set up, right? If you identify in a team sport way, whether it's with your race or your gender or your political party, you're much easier to predict and use by modernist political schemers. Just like if you have a much more hackable, easily identified brain, you're much more useful to commercial marketers. So there's a way in which the supposedly world-centric system really is incentivized to generate people who are over-identified in many respects.
Yeah, that's a thing too, because there's like world-centric exploitative, and then there's world-centric sort of like more sacrificial. And they get confused with one another a lot, like in a lot of social critiques. Like when people say, you know, anytime someone says like the capitalists or the left is a red flag to me, because I'm like, they're confusing sort of two value systems that aren't necessarily interchangeable, but are chameleon-like in how they show up. One of which is chameleon-like in the sense that it's like, if I pretend to be this, it gains, like I gain, I win because it's competitive. And then there's one that like shows up as the other because it thinks it's more progressive than it actually is. And you know, if one is, I think, authentically pluralistic, their language patterns will be a lot more complex. And there's a lot of like false pluralism that is actually sort of more absolutist or more black and white or more exploitative. And you can tell by the language patterns, you can tell by the sort of types of arguments, because the same sort of types of arguments and the values will show up. It's sort of tricky to discern for most people because they don't have the stages, values, sort of like framework to work from.
You know, I think it also, you know, we go back to, are they cognitively developed there, or are they emotionally and morally developed there? And I think, you know, just because they understand a stage, which means they're able to use the linguistic structures, either weaponize them or simply use them for manipulation. Or, as Scout said, like lower stage, you know, to realize lower stage values or from lower stage motivations. So there, you know, there's a tangible difference between somebody who comes from a world-centric place or trans, you know, personal place, and wants to recycle, or, you know, because it's good for the planet, or somebody who wants to recycle because they feel good about themselves because they do, or somebody who wants everyone to recycle, but it's like, but you know, fuck, not me though, like not really, you know, the not in my backyard kind of thing, or we
they
should
recycle
do that, just not
because it's
around
it's
here.
the right thing to do. Like everyone expects you to do it, and that's why you do it, because that's just what you do, you know.
Right.
That can be another way.
But you know, I think we really do need to focus on the moral and emotional development, which are sort of intrinsically tied. And you know, something that you said too, Layman, it reminded me in Scout, that there's a techno-economic base underlying every stage of development in terms of values. So, you know, spiral dynamics, geekery for a second. So for blue, it was, you know, agriculture. And for orange, it's, you know, capitalism and industrialization, right? And for green, it was information, the information society. And we don't really know what integral is, but it's, you know, it's looking more service oriented, but I think there's a techno-economic base underlying every, you know, major unfolding. And you know, this isn't very popular for some of my more progressive friends, but you know, every community, every culture, every nation has its own stage of development. And when you look at economics, you can't really apply really advanced structures to developing markets and expect to get similar results. Like it has to be has to be rolled out in stages. And I think that's important.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's also an interesting thing about the way that when people are more authentically showing up at, say, a world-centric experience, that there's a richness and an internal diversity to that. It's not idealistic. It's not homogenous, right? There's a sense in which if my, say, ethical experience incorporates all types of human beings, that doesn't mean I'm ethically obligated to them all equally. I'm still going to save my kids from the fire first. It's just that I can now include people from any category, right? Or like I'm not equally turned on by all races, but there's none that are being excluded from that necessarily for any special reason, even though I might favor some over some others.
Sure.
I also wonder how like types and lines factor into this. We've talked about stages a lot with like, and last time we in particular, we talked about stages a lot. And like this time I was hoping we could focus more on types, which we have been a little bit. I'm also wondering how lines factor into this. And like, that's genuinely a question, because like developmental lines are something that I probably know the least about as far as like the ACL is concerned, but it feels relevant here. And I'm curious how you guys think that might be relevant.
In terms of types, I would love to move into gender stuff. The reason I want to talk about ethnicity and gender is because they're so timely, and they're so relevant for people's lives. So
I have a question about that. And first I'd like to Scout's point, kind of maybe make a distinction where in my mind I think a multiplicity or a balance of lines is really important for an individual to be showing up at a stage. But having a bunch of types of people showing up at a stage is important sociologically, interpersonally.
Yep.
Jason, when it comes to gender as one of the typologies that we're most sure about, like there's a lot of hypothetical typologies, whether it's the Enneagram or the horoscope or Myers-Briggs or whatever it is. And it's still a pretty nebulous territory, really clarifying types. But the masculine feminine polarity has been with us a long time and has proved very useful for the species to organize itself. When you think of those, do you think of those as types or as clusters of types? Like, is masculine a type, a way of being, or are there a cluster of ways of equally well being masculine?
I have such an answer for this, but I'll wait till you ask Jason. So.
Go ahead.
No.
All right.
I really want to hear what you have to say.
So at first, I just want to remind everybody that typing system, whether it's the Enneagram or Myers-Briggs or Zodiac or masculine and feminine, they get less and less accurate as predictors of behavior the more we evolve. So, that's just sort of part and parcel of evolution. And I don't think it's any different with masculine, feminine, which I think is, we want to, it really doesn't, I consider them energetic flows is the short answer, or ways of approaching things or ways of embodying things. I don't relate it to genitalia. And I think that every leader should have an equal amount of masculine and feminine qualities, like deep penetrating intentionality or spacious compassion or agency and communion, all these things that, and I think it becomes easier to call upon them at will the more you evolve. I think the reason a lot of people are having so much problem with and I'm just going to say, fucking get on board, because it's not, there's a direction. Like it's not like transgender people are going to go away. They're going to, become more and more common. And I know it's confusing for people. I did see something that said there was something like 54, gender identifications. That's where I think it goes a little crazy. Like I'm comfortable with 5, man, woman, trans female moving to male, trans male moving to female, and non-binary. Like I'm cool with that. Don't have any trouble with that. People who aren't, though, they're going to have a really tough time. And I think, believe it or not, I think one of the reasons that Trump got voted in was because people are having so much trouble with that there was also the, disenfranchised poor white folk, poor uneducated white folk who had just felt like they were being left out for so long. But I think that, it was sort of like Trump was like a backlash, and, sort of I'll call it well, I don't know if I'm going to go that far, but anyway, it was a backlash to, evolution has progressions, leaps, regressions, plateaus. And I think that was, we went too far too fast, perhaps, for some people. And so it contracted, regressed, and came out that way. And I'm not saying that's bad or wrong or good or bad. I'm just saying that's what happened. One analysis of what happened. But I think people better get on board. It's sort of like privacy. There's like, we're going, I just saw an ad for a car that now knows if your eyes are looking forward or not. I think the new Subaru, I think.
What are you, my mom, Subaru? Fuck
so
you.
It'll detect where your eyes are on the windshield and give you an alert. So it knows if you're looking at your phone or not. And I'm like, don't like it. Fucking get on board though. Like the technology, like unless you want to be driving a pre-1985 car, your computer, your car is going to be, or whenever they started having, basically whenever OnStar came online, where they could shut your car down remotely, like just get on board, like it's going in a direction. Privacy is going in a certain direction. Technology is going in a certain direction. And you just, you better embrace it. Like I got comfortable with the fact that all my texts are readable about 10 years ago when I signed up for Google Voice. I was like, all right, that's fine.
Or
Scout's been shaking her head. What's the fuck you?
You can just live off grid.
Sure.
I am not Kip Dynamite. I do not love technology. I'm
just saying kidding. I'm just saying by and large, like it's going in a certain direction. It's not going back.
Yeah.
You started talking. The whole like transhumanist versus, I guess like postmodern return to naturalism kind of like war that's going on that is like slowly bubbling and is going to come to a head probably after I die, but it's going to come to a head. And okay, so I was shaking my head just because
she doesn't like any of that. You don't like the technology thing.
It's like no, it's just like, why would I buy a car that's a cop? Like, get real.
Well, you're not their market, but if you're a parent who has enough money to buy a car for their kid who's going to college, you want it to be as safe as possible.
Yeah, buy a cop for your kid. I mean, a car.
All right,
buy a cop.
So do it. I don't care.
This is what I'm talking about right here, though. Like, that's part of the backlash.
That's not a thing that's in alignment with my personal value system, and I don't care about it. But like, it's not power to whoever the fuck wants.
It's not in line with mine either. But I recognize the fact that it's going in a particular direction.
Yeah.
And so, I think
that's called realism.
Resistance.
Yeah, there is a big hang up around realism for sure, because things are changing in a lot of areas, technologically, sociologically, ecologically. There's some pretty obvious trend lines. So you're either moving with that or you're hunkering down and pretending it's not happening, which is a pretty bad personal strategy.
Yeah, and you don't have to agree with what's happening to recognize that it's happening.
Yeah.
So like, do I really want like to live in a accelerationist, transhumanist reality? Honestly, that does sound pretty cool, but like, I'd be the weird Mad Max lady in the forest that they come to figure out how to heal wounds when the shit hits the fan. So this is why self-mythology, and I am tying this back into the types thing slowly but surely. The self-mythology piece is really important because it's like our reality is getting stranger and stranger, and like what we think is like, we need to reconcile the fact that but we need to come to terms with the fact that like what we believe is real and like the Newtonian sense and like the causal sense and like all of that Enlightenment era thinking that we still think is relevant to like this era. It's like we need to start interpreting reality in new ways. And in order to do that, we need to realize that we don't interpret reality. We interpret reality mythologically. That's just like, that's what we do. Like, we're symbolic creatures. We're metaphorical beings. Everything that we say and do and perceive is like, we do it, even like when we're describing reality in a very realistic sense, it's metaphorical and symbolic. So like, having an awareness of that and actually embracing it, I think, is really important for like what is currently emerging, and because we can't like hold on to the way we've done things as if it's like the only true way to do things. It's just not effective anymore. Yeah. And sort of like changing the subject to types, which seems to be kind of difficult to do, I've noticed. It's like we keep saying types, so then we don't actually talk about types. You brought up the Enneagram, and you brought up the Myers-Briggs, and you were talking about masculine and feminine, and sort of what I wanted to speak to about that is, like, you said that it has been very useful for our species, and I mostly agree. I think that we're reaching a sort of bluesy, for God's sake, dude. Sorry. 1 second. Hey, come inside. Go inside. Hey, sorry. You can probably cut that out, right?
I don't know.
Or leave it. I don't care. I'm sorry if that was disruptive.
I accept
what do you
your
mean?
apology.
Disruptive how?
What do you mean? What do I mean?
What do you mean? What do I mean? What do you mean? What do I mean?
So, types. Yeah. The gods are very angry and they don't want us to talk about types. Well, okay, so that's
and that's what's happening, is a greater degree of superstition is coming. So people are, I have it that because people don't want to get on board with rapidly fluid and changing, whether it's around gender in particular, or around multiculturalism, they're regressing to superstition, whether that's a bizarre, distorted version of Christianity, or whether that's, drawing cards,
or government conspiracy theory, or the genderless agenda, the gay agenda, the vaccine experimental genetics agenda, or the negative alien agenda. Like, all of this is just the gods are angry with us in different clothing.
Sure.
Yeah, so it seems like we need a mixture of, there's going to be a lot of people who need updated, better mythical metaphors that make coherent sense of the world they're in, so that part of them can stabilize and adapt to the world and move forward. But at the same time, we also want it to work really well with people who have a more complicated, more nuanced experience of what metaphor is and how the world operates and how it should work. Jason was saying how at higher stages, typologies become less predictive. They get more slippery, and that's maybe one of the reasons.
Less behaviorally predictive, yes.
Yeah, so types are very slippery in conversations that you try to do at high levels, because everybody's got more nuances and tentacles involved.
But here's the thing with typology is that there's modern typology. Okay, so there's modern typology, which is very, very behavioralist. And then there is deeper levels of typology. So if you take like the masculine and feminine thing, that's one thing I wanted to speak to. Like, it's a polarity. People refer to it as polarity, but it's a polarity. It's a specific polarity. And there are so many different types of polarity. And what's interesting is that, like, a lot of people don't really know this, but the Myers-Briggs type indicator is based on Jungian. Like, they know it's based on Jungian typology, but Jung was influenced by alchemy, Hermetic alchemy, which talks about polarity a lot as a philosophy. And that philosophy particularly would talk about the polarity between, say, the sun and the moon. So what Jung sort of interpreted that as introversion, the moon, and extroversion, the sun. And masculine feminine is like just another one of those, right? So you have like introversion, extroversion, you have like feeling, thinking, and then you pair the polarities with each other and you get even more polarity. So it's actually really quite complex when you look at the structure of it. Most people don't look at the structure of it. They're just like, oh, you're an ENFP, that's why you don't have an attention span. And I'm like, you read that on somebody's blog, didn't you? As opposed to like extroverted intuition. Everyone uses extroverted intuition. How well they use it depends on what sort of like cognitive functions were most necessary to use for their survival up until like, you know, it solidifies and then it just becomes like a habit. So it's not who you are, it's it's the character you're used to playing. It's like you are a drama kid, right? And you get cast as like Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. You're not Dorothy, you just practice her line so often that you can step into Dorothy when you need to, which is when you're on stage. And then when you're off stage, you step out of Dorothy. People have problems stepping off stage. You know, it's not that they are Dorothy, it's that they've learned to be Dorothy and they're so used to being Dorothy or being ENFP or being masculine or what have you, that like they think it's who they are and they're so good at it that why wouldn't they be it? You know, so it I think when you know, at later stages, it goes from this is not who I am, this is who I'm practiced at being. And because I'm good at it, I will find a place that needs this because this is like, it's more of an effectiveness thing than it is like I need to be like at earlier stages. It's more about, I need to be this either for the tribe or so that I don't die. That's true at later stages, I think, but there's another piece that comes in where it's like, what part of reality is this character most suited to? Like, where's the stage, basically, you know?
Yeah, it seems to shed a little bit of the normative aspect of categories. Like there's a sense in which people think, oh, I have this habit or I'm in this group and therefore I should be that person. And I was just thinking of, the Armenian mystic Gurdjieff had this question he was asked in like 1917 about horoscopes. He said, oh, yes, this is a very ancient, very powerful system of organizing people. And the characteristics of your horoscope sign are the things that are wrong with you. So you should be actively working to get rid of those specific characteristics.
That's hilarious.
That's funny.
He's anti-normatively using the categorization system.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's similar to how I use them. So yeah, totally.
And I think
not this is wrong with you, but like you are not beholden to this. These are your habits, and let's take a look at them. Let's see how they can be used more consciously. You know,
I think we run into trouble, mostly for the person who does it. Which when I say that, I mean it's going to be predictable that they're going to either slow their growth or they're going to have outright misery as a result. If they identify, if their identification and identity makeup is run by their typology. So like, I'm a man, therefore I'm supposed to be masculine, or I'm, an Enneagram 4, therefore I have to, or, I start putting people in boxes. One of the first articles I wrote, I think in 2004 or something, was called The Cult of Classification. Like there's this people want to know your typology right away. And part of that is so they, like some people from a trans-rational perspective, want to relate with you and they want to know as much about you as possible. That's cool. For the most part, though, it's so that they can put you in a box. Then they think they know how you're going to behave. That whether it's your, are you a Democrat or a Republican? Are you what's your Myers-Briggs type? What's your Enneagram type? What's your sexual orientation? What's your, all these things where people want to stop relating to the dynamic human being in front of them, and they want to start relating to their typology. Or they're like, well, that's because I'm a Capricorn or because I'm an Aquarius. And
they want to use it as an excuse for their behavior. And
nobody, by the way,
and a way to control other people by conceptually boxing them.
And like, also, you're supposed to be this. Why aren't you?
there's a laziness to it
that.
as well, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot
Yep.
less work I have to do if I can just put you in a box.
Mm-hmm.
And also they're very simple boxes. Like I get why racism is a thing, right? Because it's pretty easy to see skin color. If you had to go by differences in pancreas shape, it never would have got off the ground. That's too much work.
Well, you know, I think it's funny. I think it's almost paradoxical. Like sometimes I'll ask a client to take a Myers-Briggs test, so I know how to more effectively communicate with them.
Right.
But usually, like, I don't care about any of that. You know, first of all, nobody. I don't think anybody's actually been able to accurately assess my zodiac sign. And the first time I encountered the Enneagram, it took the guy who was supposedly an expert. It took him 5 guesses, and he was like, he was so excited. He's like, "Yeah, I got you." I'm like, "Well, process of elimination. You only had 4 left." You know, like,
right.
Geez. But
I would.
you know,
sorry, I would actually love to speak to that when you're done, because I have.
Yeah. Well, you actually did nail my Enneagram, but and you even nailed the wings, I think.
Yeah.
But,
and I can also, I bet there's. Do you know your instinctual variant?
I don't even know what that is, because, you know. So
that's what I want to speak to, but continue. Yeah.
to the paradox, like Layman was saying, it is lazy. Like, it is lazy because they don't have to relate to the person in front of them, but it actually takes more effort. Like, I just relate to how we are right now. Like, what's my interaction with the person right now? But that takes a lot of fluidity and a lot of being able to be present and not have the typology stuff in the way. So it's scarier for people because they don't know how to deal with the seeming chaos of that. But it actually takes a lot less effort because I just have to be with them. So it's not lazier because it takes more.
Yeah, they just have to listen to you and be present, and that's hard for most people.
Yeah, there's a greater effort element to it, but it's also more efficient in a lot of ways.
Way more efficient.
Did you want to say something about instinctive types?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to speak to what Jason was talking about in terms of like why people type people. And it's interesting because like I have this practice that I'm currently refining that I call it transrational magic. And the reason why I call it that is because it's about mythology of the self. So the typology systems are basically mythology of the self. It's how have you mythologized yourself? Like what character have you decided to play? And not necessarily who are you, you know, because personality is just, it's a role that you play, that you choose to play. And the increasing complexity comes when we look at all of the types. And this is the integral piece that I'm trying to bring into typology, is that like, you're not just an Enneagram 4-wing 3. Like if I had to guess, and like, obviously I'm always open to being wrong. And why people are wrong is because all the types are working with you, right? So like, he might've been like, oh, I know your Enneagram type. And it was hard for him to tell because INTJ 4s are rare. So it might've been harder for him to like, whereas ENFP 4s are very common. So when people are like, oh, you're type 4, it's like, yeah, that wasn't that hard to figure out because the 2 types show up together a lot. Your 2 types, those 2 types don't show up together a lot. When you bring in the astrology piece, your astrological chart is incredibly complex. You have a lot of different signs competing with each other that don't necessarily flow well together. So that the level of complexity that's there when you look at all of those sort of typology systems together is slightly more accurate to the complexity of a human being than just looking at it from any one lens. And so like how you've mythologized yourself is not just I'm this character. When you look at it from the lens of like all of the types, it's like, here is like the ranking of like the access I've given myself to specific archetypes. This is the one I have the most access to. This is maybe one I have a little less access to, because you have access to all of them. That's the whole point. And so typology needs to sort of like shift from this is who I am to like, this is how easily I can access different ways of being. if that makes sense.
That's especially pertinent for people who are going into a more post-conventional mode of being, because they're much more aware of themselves as containing all of those types in some kind of organized system. So they need a much more complex version of any kind of typology in order to match up with their experience of who they are. And also, like, I think more nuanced people have a harder time with all the questions. I certainly do. I took a cognitive types test a couple of weeks ago online, and it said, your type is multiple types. Please consider these other tests. I've gotten responses like that a lot from typological tests over the years.
No, me too. Yeah. I like high tripe on the Enneagram all the time now that I'm an adult. Whereas like when I was a teenager, it was just like, you are type 4 wing 3. And then like I shifted to 4 wing 5, not like 2-3 years ago, because guess what? I changed as a person.
And the meanings of things changed. Like Tom Habib was doing a study for the Integral European Conference about what the role of highly sensitive persons is in terms of sourcing people who move into integral consciousness. And I took the test, but it was hell for me, because the questions were like, do you find yourself emotionally disturbed watching casual entertainment? I'm like, well, I don't know. I'm sitting there on the couch crying, but I don't feel bothered by it. It seems okay. I don't think I'm disturbed. So what's the answer to this question that's going to facilitate the typology?
Yep.
I get misty-eyed watching touching television commercials, but I love watching serial killer things. You know, like Hannibal Lecter, awesome. Oh, a touching moment, you know, in a car commercial. Oh,
yeah.
My girlfriend and I were just saying that the other day, is that we very often put on like a zombie show in the evening and then just like talk or hang out. It's very relaxing. And, you know, I see someone from another generation, like, that's the desensitization we were talking about. You're like, no, I don't know. Just sounds fine.
I find Hannibal Lecter soothing.
You know something, Jason? You want to know something? I think like when you bring in
lots of things.
So there's this phenomenon that happens when people experience severe trauma, where they laugh when they hear bad news and they cry when they hear good news. And so it's funny because it's like, and this is true of like any sort of typological system. And this is why I don't appreciate people dismissing, say, Myers-Briggs, like, oh, this is like debunked or whatever. And it's like, it's not as simple as just debunking it. It's just like to quote Radiohead, everything in its right place. So like knowing that this can only be so accurate, like it's not factoring in how I might uniquely respond to my own emotional experience of things. Like I stare at roadkill just staring at it. I feel nothing. I watched an episode of Loki the other day, and I was like sobbing because like Loki's character was experiencing character development. And I was like, oh my God. I was just uncontrollable tears. And it was like, dude, you just took a photo of a dead beaver like 2 days ago. Like, what are you doing? You know what I mean? And so it's like, because of what meaning do I give to death? And then what meaning do I give to character development? Like witnessing the growth of a person. I might, give different meaning to that than what like is normative, because the normative is death is sad. Developing as a person is happy. Like, we don't know if that's how I experience those phenomena. We just assume I do because it's normative.
I would like to normalize referring to normative people as average.
I don't like the because I don't like
and neurodivergent as elite.
So I don't particularly like the responsibility that you just placed on me as a neurodivergent person by calling me elite. So I'm not down.
No, but it's all in your hands now, Scout.
Do what thou wilt, shall be the will of the law.
That makes you an outlier, so you're even more special now.
Okay. An outlier.
You're speaking of my type 4 right now, Jason.
Like I said, I like to know typology so I can more effectively communicate.
Yeah.
This question of uniqueness that you were mentioning, Scout, has an interesting intersection with the trans issue, because one of the complaints from the TERFs, from the feminist complaint about trans, is that it might lean into stereotypes about masculine and feminine too much, and not appreciate the uniqueness in which those different styles can be lived out by different people. So that a person who feels like they don't conform to a certain definition, a certain normative definition of a gender, thinks they must be the other gender, rather than realizing there's a whole bunch of extremely unique and diverse ways to be each of the genders. I think that's that's the sort of advanced intellectual feminist critique of the trans thing. Now, there's counter critiques, but it's an interesting approach.
Well, people don't realize that, like, sorry, go ahead.
Fundamentalists and conventional people show up in every type of scenario. I remember when I thought when gay marriage, I think it was Prop 8 or something in California, when gay marriage was on the table, I was like, what? Like, and you know, they immediately wanted to, like, they were incredibly conventional, like monogamous, you know, dog first, buy a house, adoption. I was like, God, there was this incredible, I viewed it as an opportunity to really experience diversity in, you know, like, people were like, well, what's next? Like polyamorous marriage? So I was like, bring it. Like, so what? You know, I give it, but
why not? I don't get that.
But I was surprised, because about half my clients were gay men at the time, and they were all professional, you know, in their own business, and they were incredibly conservative. Didn't like most, like, they don't, you know, I had an office in San Francisco. They didn't like hanging out in the Castro. They were really against a lot of the sexual freedom that a lot of people of the same orientation had. And I was stunned by how conservative they were. And you know, and I just, like, I was surprised when I went on my first Vipassana retreat, how fundamentalists they were, you know, around desire. And, you know, like, men and women shouldn't even talk to each other because it could lead to desire, because, and that, you know, and it, like, it looked just like the college my sister went to, where she got her PhD, dancing wasn't allowed because it, like, they considered it foreplay. And I
mean, it kind of is.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying that, you know, fundamentalism can show up everywhere. There's Buddhist fundamentalists, there's gender fundamentalists, you know, and I think people need to get on, like, they're just going to suffer if they don't realize the realities of where society is progressing to. And the part of the point I really want to make, you know, at the, you know, even before this call, about gender, especially the trans issue, I saw some statistics around what happened when being left-handed stopped being associated with the devil, and the number of left-handed people skyrocketed, like when it became okay. You know, if we look at society, like, it's not like people are turning gay. It's just okay now, for the most part. Like, they just had a NFL lineman come out and say he's currently starting for the Raiders. And he came out as gay, and people were like, okay, so what? Like, which means we're heading in the right direction. But a lot of NFL players in the 90s said, yeah, there was plenty of gay guys in the locker room. We just didn't care if they could play ball. Like, all that, you know, in the locker room. It's really society that was like, oh, well, you know. And so I think the same thing is happening with transgender. Just like, you know, there's more and more openly gay people, because it's getting more and more. I think like 60% of people now in America don't care if you're, or they're in favor of gay marriage. You know, there's a plurality now that's in favor of it, or at least accepting of it. I think the same thing is going to happen with trans. I think there's probably people who feel like they were trapped in the wrong body for a long time. Now that it's more and more acceptable.
This is true of neurodiversity as well, I think.
Yeah. And, or just, you know, like,
yeah, there's been a lot of failure to appreciate the richness of the actualities that we inhabit. I think it's really important to remember what you're saying here, Jason. that pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional show up in every identity, in every type, in every aspect of life. And there's also an interesting feature, which is some people or types of people that aren't as well registered in the society may suffer certain kinds of developmental retardation, let's say, in aspects of themselves. I had a very interesting talk with my friend Ari Allen about his stages of development in terms of his identity as a gay man. And his opinion was that because he didn't feel fully registered by the society, he thought that his developmental phases socially were held back a little. And that it was only later when he fully said, you know what, I'm gay. And he was, you know, in his 20s, and he started to have his adolescence as a gay man then. So there might be ways in which people are, you know, maybe more conventional than they might otherwise be because the system didn't help them move ahead at their optimal rate.
I had a couple of those gay clients. I had conversations with them about the gay community. This is, a decade ago. And I asked one of them, I was like, what is with the younger generation having sort of that gay accent? Like, what's the, and his answer was, I think they knew they were gay before they knew who they were as humans, as men. Like, so they knew they were gay early on. So they took on this sort of affect. And the other question I had for a different client, he even within the gay community, there's actually a lot of shame around being just a bottom. And so not only do some gays judge bottoms, but some, not all of them, but there's a percentage of them, they judge themselves for being exclusively bottoms. And I thought it was a fascinating aspect of, like, even within gay culture, there's some sort of judgment or shame, which doesn't register or make any sense to me. It's like,
that's really interesting because there are groups or types of people that suffer these various stigmas, but they're not part of the normal conversation about who suffers the stigmas. I was just watching the comedian Doug Stanhope. I watched a special that he did last night, right? And he was talking about discrimination against ugly people, right? And he's like, if you lose a job because you're ugly, it's not like losing a job because you're black or a woman or Asian, because there's no group that's going to back you up on that. Nobody's going to stand with you.
Ugly people representation now.
It's not one of the categories that we've validated as one of the categories that you can be stigmatized into, even though
it shows up.
Layman,
it shows up
Layman.
There's.
Can you make the icon for this next, or can you tell Bruce to make the icon for this next one? The SpongeBob screaming, "I'm ugly and I'm proud." You know that episode of SpongeBob where he's like screaming from the rooftop. He's like, "I'm ugly and I'm proud. I'm ugly and I'm proud."
All right, if you're watching this, Bruce, give it a try. As long as
I'll message him.
I don't know if that's
representative
of the.
I think it encompasses absolutely everything. It's completely relevant to the entire conversation, and we need to do it.
I don't see it. I don't see it.
That's because it's not there.
And
I'm trolling right now. Sorry.
The nature of the categories.
Why are you trolling? Is it because I'm black?
I didn't want to bring it up, but it has been bothering me.
Being a troll is my identity. So,
what the categories are that are pertinent to identity, I think, is very intriguing, because obviously some of them are more useful than others, right? And there might be categories that we want to bring forward and tell a story about because it enables a bunch of people who felt otherwise marginalized to start to really show up as who they've been all this time in society. But on the other hand, there's categories that might turn out to have no real basis at all, in the same way that we used to treat whales as fish based on some very general characteristics. And we looked inside their body and we're like, oh, they were mammals all along. That was not the right way to organize these phenomenon. And Bruce and I have done work on integral religion, and there's a question about whether the religions actually represent the categories of religion at all. Right. If you have there's a sect of Buddhists that believe if you call on the name of the compassionate light Buddha, then you'll be reborn in a heavenly realm where it's very easy to attain enlightenment. And that sounds pretty Christian. And then on the other hand, there's Christians like Meister Eckhart who interpret the entire Bible as a kind of Zen code for emptying your mind. So which one's the Christian and which one's the Buddhist? It may be that those are not at all the right ways to categorize human religiosity, right? And it may be that we're using the wrong types of categories to get the optimal effect in a whole bunch of areas, because there's no reason to think what was easy for our ancestors to use as chunks of identification or at all representative of the richness of what human beings are.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't map their interior, their interiors, their interior.
The guy, I don't know if you guys read Eat Right for Your Blood Type. It was like a big book 20 years ago or something like that. But I saw a fascinating interview with the guy who did that. And he said, yeah, basically, I was on the right track. The only thing that's wrong about that book are the dietary recommendations for specific blood types.
I was gonna say, so I was aware of that diet, and it made the most sense to me. I was like, that makes a lot of sense. And I recently researched it, and it totally broke down. I'm glad he said that.
What this guy's doing now, though, is looking for physiological typologies using a very complex computational system, right? We go, okay, there are these blood types, and there are 3 types of gut bacteria, and there are these different modes of your neurology. So you start grouping together these different sets of physical, and you go, well, is there a way the computer can help us group a bunch of these traits together and call those types or not? Because if we knew that, the effects of the medicines and the treatments we give each other might be very different.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I was 15 years old or 16 years old when my mom went on that diet, and I tried to tell her, like, hey, Mom, and this is so funny because it's like, obviously I'm not like super developed at this point because I'm a teenager, but like I am a very skeptical, like I've always been a very skeptical person who's like, something seems like it's missing here. Even as a kid, like I was like one of those kids who like never grew out of the why phase is like what I tell people. But like, I'm like, so like, how does one aspect of your body determine, like, how is there any one thing of the body that can be centered as like the thing? Like, oh, it's the blood that determines how you should eat, or oh, it's the bone structure that determines whether you're blah, 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 or whatever, or like, oh, your skin is like the thing. Like when, like something that doesn't really make sense to me in like conventional femininity and like the culture of that is like skincare routines is like, oh, this is how you have good skin. You just like put 17 different products on it and then it looks good. And I'm like, what about the interiors of your body that affect the skin? What about like the complex system that is the body? Like, and so complex systems, like, I don't know a whole lot about complex systems theory. I only know about it sort of like as it relates to like studying integral, but I feel like the complex systems sort of like as a general way of understanding reality is really, really crucial for anything to even make sense anymore. Because we've come to realize that like simplicity is not like, we tend to oversimplify things that we don't really understand, and like in order to understand them, we need to sort of like realize like it's the whole holons thing. It's like a complex system is like a system that consists of multiple systems, right? And so there's like there's an interaction that goes on with these systems, and then the systems have like parts, and then those parts are made of parts, and there's all these things going on. And if we have this tendency to just like choose the one thing, like even like when we were talking about typology earlier, like, oh, makes sense because you're a type 4. And then I'm reduced to that type 4 instead of being like, oh, here are some qualities of the type 4. And how do those interact with, your context and your other ways that you define yourself and the relationships that you have in your life and other things that are whole aspects onto themselves of reality. But together they create this larger whole of which I am a part,
Feels like there's a time frame issue here as well. Like if you're going to have a very brief interaction with someone, then just anything that gives you a handle on them might be useful. But if you're going to have an extended interaction, then you have to be adapted to that extent, right? You have to be ready to have a longer conversation or get into more things with them. And when we do those, they do those association tests, like how rapidly does your brain associate a positive quality or a negative quality with this image or that type of person. You can see that at extremely short time scales, we might treat people in certain kinds of categories, but if we have an extra few seconds to think about it, we might not double down on those categories. So a lot of the way we treat other people is based on our guess about how much interaction and over what span of time we're going to be engaging them.
Yep. And I think that might also have to do with like certain things like authenticity. Like, do I need to be authentic with this person? Or is it like more appropriate that is it more appropriate that I hide certain aspects of myself, not because I'm a dishonest person or not because I'm ashamed of anything, but because like, does it matter? Will it matter in the future? For sure. Wow.
Yeah. Well, and, is there a place for them to fit that in their map of the world? Will it blow them out? I mean, it's kind of, I've always valued authenticity over connection. And so, and there are serious downsides to that. I've been disinvited from certain things because they're like, well, we never know what you're going to say. And it's too unpredictable. And we don't, want that element there. And also it's always difficult for me because I grew up outside of most social conventions. Like there's a part of me that just doesn't, I've gotten much better at it over the years through my development, but knowing, sometimes I'm shocked that certain things are not okay. And usually, part of the problem is I usually zero in on something that's a little too accurate. I'll never forget I think it was the first time, this is my life partner. We'd been dating about 6 months. Oh, no, we'd been dating a year. And it was Mother's Day, and her mother was coming over with her brother. And he had been in a coma for 9 months. And first I was very curious, like, wow, did you, like, I've never talked to somebody who got out of a coma. Like, were you aware? He's like, oh yeah, I heard everything that, like, he was aware of everything that people were saying to him. It was just like he was internally paralyzed. Like he couldn't respond to them. I was like, well, that's fascinating. It's like, how'd you get there? What'd you do? Slam a bunch of meth? Everybody got quiet. Turns out he had. Like that was he got a bad batch or something. And so then he and I, talked for like a half hour. Now it was a small group, and, there were some, I think her sister was upset with me for certain things. And, she came from a very conventional. Now he and I built a great deal of rapport because he was able, like, it was okay with him that I nailed it. And I've done that a lot, just making a joke. I end up, hitting the deepest, and it's sort of my gift to trigger someone's core wound, if you want to call it. Like a client who's got abandonment issues that I'm unaware of, I might accidentally forget that session, like not put it in my account. Like it's one of those weird things, which is, a gift and a curse. But I think it's far more wise to determine what people can hear, what's appropriate for the setting. But also I think a lot of people they find it refreshing, if you're not, there's a lot of people just living a lie about who they are, what they are, and what's important to them. And at least you never have to guess with me whether I like you or not, or whether I.
It's actually my favorite thing. My favorite thing about working with Jason is that, like, my one core wound that I have is like, I'm not good enough. And like all Jason ever does is like, he lets me know like, hey, this is brilliant. And he'll always be like, this is brilliant. Just, it's like, I don't have to question it. I don't have to feel like he's placating me. If it's not good enough, he'll be like, you could do better. And it's like, oh, that hurts. But like the fact that you're straightforward about the positive feedback makes me know that the negative feedback is not a criticism of who I am.
Yeah.
It's like coming from a place of, you've seen me at my best, so you know what I can actually accomplish.
Also,
as opposed to like,
Yeah, there's a identification thing there too. Like there's practical and then there's personal, there's results, and then there's validation, and those are self-esteem conversations, that worthiness, and efficacy, those two components. And collapse,
and there's also competence plays a role.
Having those two collapsed is what causes a lot of people to not be able to receive feedback.
Yeah, it does seem like people, whether it's positive or negative feedback, when it seems like the feedback is about who you are as a person, especially when you're a kid, it can be very destabilizing. Like there was a conversation around self-esteem for years, and we try to validate everybody's self-esteem. But I think we've seen now that just telling people they're wonderful can be as damaging as telling them they're no good. Because you're just you're hyper identifying them with who they are right now, and you're conflating what they've done with who they are.
It's all in the language
to work on.
It's all in the language patterns. But it's all in the language patterns. Wait, sorry, go ahead.
That's not self-esteem. That's other esteem. Like trying to, like, at the end of the day, people have to, like, if somebody tells me I'm great at something, I have to go, yeah, I am, or I'll reject it. Like, it's so, like, trying to trying to develop somebody's self-esteem, I'll say develop, by giving them accolades. It's not actually self-esteem, it's other esteem. And seeking that out actually undermines building your self-esteem. It actually, and it's pseudo self-esteem. And again, if you're attached to getting positive feedback, as a way of validating yourself, you're in a particular kind of hell, because you're going to be, running around being a people pleaser. And so,
it's like being in a cult in the negative sense, right? It's like, hey, I'm a good person because I'm a member of the North Korean society. And that's what keeps me going. What were you going to say about language, though, Scout?
Well, I was going to say, like, one of the most interesting philosophical concepts that I've stumbled upon is like it's Lacanian. I hate the way that Americans say things, but that's how we say it. We say Lacanian or Lacanian, Lacanian or Lacanian. Lacanian is slightly less ridiculous, but I'm not French, so I'm not going to try and butcher that term. But the whole concept of the mirror stage and, like, our language patterns and how we sort of create our own identity crises by the way that we symbolically represent ourselves in reality. So, like, with the mirror stage, that sort of the not metaphor, but like the scenario that represents is, you're a child, you don't know you're separate from your reality. You're just like, I see a hand, I see a foot, like, I see my mom, like, you think everything is just one thing. You get to a point where your mother brings you to a mirror or a reflective surface and points to you and says, it doesn't point to you, points to the mirror, which is outside of you, and says, that is you, And so that, as a language pattern, it teaches you that this is out there, And I think that something similar goes on when people say, you're great, you're smart, because then when you're not smart, you go, I'm not me. I am not myself unless I am what this person tells me I am. And it's like when you're an adult, whatever, but when you're a child, you're not really in charge of your authoring. You're just like a sponge, and everything that happens to you authors you. You're not really in control of it. You don't become in control of it until you're older and your brain develops more. And, typically, even when people are older, they don't get to that point of self-authoring, really. But when you're a kid, like, your authoring sort of happens through your experiences and through what people tell you are. And so when we tell people that they are what they do, when they're not being that, they feel like they have to be what they're told they are in order to exist. It's not even just, oh, I'm a bad person if I don't do that. It's, I'm not a person if I don't do that, because I am that thing.
So there's an interesting,
I think that can be, that's sort of problematic.
Yeah, whether development would be accelerated for people if they got more nuanced and more accurate and more authentic languaging in their early, right? If someone didn't say that's you, but that's your reflection, or they said,
Right.
you know, that's
You
brilliant, or
look
this
like
isn't your
this.
best work, but not you're great or
Right.
you're terrible. Would
Yeah.
that actually, you know, would that lay the wiring for a person to move forward more rapidly?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I have
think
it.
so.
No, I'm going to say absolutely yes. There's a couple of things I write over and over again. One of them is that, communication skills are physical skills, and navigating your interior is a physical skill. And the reason I say it is because it takes practice. It's awkward at first. You become more and more masterful. You can make more and more advanced moves like that. So the metaphor, it's not just but I think it's real. Like, I think it's actually, it's a skill to develop, navigating your interiors, and that gives people room to make mistakes and to get more and more facile with it, right? The other thing I say is that, the practice and the evidence of personal evolution is the ability to take on an ever increasing number of perspectives. The other thing I say is that your linguistic structures are they're sort of the vines, or they're the lattice work. Like, your linguistic structures are the lattice work upon which your evolution can grow, like vines, growing upward or whichever direction you put the lattice work. And I think that's important. The other thing I just want to circle back to is, Scout, thanks for pointing it out. I often skip over the child development part. So when I talk about self-esteem, I'm assuming an adult. I'm assuming somebody who's no longer fused with the people who were influencing them in their formative years. So, until you have a separate identity, until your egos develop, like, have to differentiate first.
I would argue that there's a lot of people who are adults and have not actually done that.
Maybe. I'm going to say, as adults, that whether they realize it or not, there's still the authority, because they have to agree or disagree with the feet. Like, if somebody goes, "Oh, you're a piece of shit," and they're like, "Yeah, I guess they're right." Like, there's a choice point there, whether they realize it or not. And so to blame the other person, and I see this a lot.
Yeah, of course.
They don't want to take responsibility for that authorship, but they're engaged in unconsciously anyway. And so they want to blame the other person for harming their self-esteem. I'm like, they can't. It's self-esteem. They might have harmed your perception of how they view you. They might have harmed your pseudo self-esteem.
Yep.
And I think it's, anyway, those are my thoughts on that.
Yeah.
It's a blurry line, that self and other esteem. It reminds me
they're not aware that we don't have like a sort of like threshold initiation culture anymore. And I think that most people are not aware of the transition from other authoring to self-authoring. And so then they, the reason why they're stuck in blame is because, like, they have a power that they're not conscious of yet. It's like Harry Potter. He doesn't know he's a fucking wizard. He's doing all this shit. He's like, what was that? Couldn't have been me, but it was him the whole time. He just didn't know it because no one told him he was a fucking wizard. And then someone comes and tells him he's a wizard, and he's like, I'm a what? Like, I'm in charge of my own self-esteem. What?
I mean, if you believe the books, but there's a conspiracy theory that you knew the whole time.
Well, they can suck my left toe. I'm trying to make a point here, and I think it was a very good point. So sorry. I'm the troll. Don't threaten my identity as the troll.
I was diverging
there can only be one.
Neurologically.
There's a significant difference between what we're able to enact and what we recognize about what we're able to enact.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when I say people aren't differentiate from their parents, that's not an excuse to sort of like say like they shouldn't, like, oh, they can't like have that facility. It's like they can, they just are not aware that they can, so they don't. And they don't because they don't know they can. I think at younger or earlier stages they can't actually. Like, I don't think they have the cognitive or
emotional faculties, like a 5-year-old. So that's the part I didn't want to skip over. I presuppose a certain level of adulthood. So when I say all the stuff I say, I'm really not taking into account child development. It's just not my area of expertise. So thanks for bringing it up. But that's the part I wanted to circle back to and clean up.
There's something I wanted to circle back to from earlier in the discussion that was on my mind, which was the role of quadrants, or the role of different viewpoints on situations and how they pertain to identities and roles and ethnicities and things like that. I was thinking about the pulp horror author H.P. Lovecraft, whose life I know something about. And he was married to a Jew, and his best friend was a Jew. So in his actual life, he got along with them very well, but his views on Jews were quite horrific and barbaric. But these were different zones of inquiry. And it's sort of like, right, if you see a situation where a young black man is, traumatized and attacked by police officers, then like, how do you respond? Like, it's different if you think, oh, if that was my son, what would I tell him about how to deal with this situation? But on the other hand, if I was in charge of the police force, how would I reform what they're doing? These are different domains. And the sociological analysis is often very different from the kind of coaching analysis, which is about helping an individual figure out what would be best for them in a circumstance.
I think in terms of quadrants, also like in terms of like gender. I mean, and in quadrants, external objective. Joy is just dopamine, right? And then interior subjective, it's the experience of joy. I think we can certainly apply that to gender identity, like, exterior objective, you got a cock, male, like masculine, right? Interior subjective is going to be very different. And so I think it's like, when we collapse these quadrants, we just run into trouble. And a lot of the disagreement is simply about the fact that they're collapsing these.
Right. And people collapse them because what they're trying to actually do is include them, but they don't know how. So when when TERFs are like, we call them TERFs, but like, I think there's a difference between like a TERF who's actually trying to exclude trans women from a conversation and someone who is trying to differentiate the internal subjective experience of being a trans woman who has an external objective different genitalia and hormone structure and bone structure and all of that from a different type of woman who has like, a vagina and like different. It's like you can differentiate a trans woman from a cis woman. That's why we have different terms for them. That's why, but you can still include them both in the conversation of what it means to be feminine in society, but their experiences are gonna be different. And you have to so you want to include the differentiation.
Yeah.
But you don't want to, while you're talking about the shared experience, but you don't want to exclude the differentiation for fear of excluding the person, So like speaking to like the transgender experience, you have to, you can't reduce it to like, oh, it's everyone's having the same experience because we're all human. That's not necessarily true, because there's, and this is where intersectionality does kind of succeed when it doesn't focus on the oppression narrative, when it focuses on the differentiation and including the differentiation without excluding the person, which is very difficult unless you're at a certain stage of development, as like Jason would probably say, is like, the nuance is really, really important.
There seems like there's an extension of intersectionality that would be a really good way to counterbalance, I think, what you were talking about, which is the attempt to include without adequately differentiating.
Right.
Like there's no reason your ID card can't say your gender identity and your anatomy and your genetic makeup. Right. And there's lots of sociological things in which you should be identified by how you choose to identify. But when you go into the doctor unconscious and bleeding, they might need to know something about you that isn't your social gender identification. So those can be different things, and we can build a system where those different things are taken into account and their intersections are registered.
Yeah. Without excluding the interior subjective of the person's experience. Exactly.
Yeah, I think there's, I just talked about collapsing the two quadrants, but I think there's another problem that occurs, and not so dissimilar from the pre-trans fallacy. Like, somebody who's embedded in one quadrant is going to invalidate the other quadrant.
Yeah.
And vice versa. Like, no, it doesn't matter what your interior subjective experience is. Here's the external objective. And then other people are going to say, it doesn't matter what the external objective is. What matters is my interior subjective. When the reality is they both matter. They're both valid. Yeah. And so collapsing them causes a certain kind of problem. And then being embedded in one and invalidating the other also creates other kinds of problems.
Yep.
Yeah, my expanded notion of ideology is a bit like that. It's about quadrants substituting for each other, right? The sort of Marxist critique ideologically is the systems that we're engaged in substitute for our identity. And we have a false consciousness where we think we believe certain things and hold certain values, but that's only because our paycheck depends upon it, or that's how we organize society. But you can expand that and say any one of these quadrants can surreptitiously take the place of one of the others. And then you get something very much like conflation, where they're just confused. We need to unpack them and put them back where they belong so we can deal with them each appropriately.
I think the Marriage of Sense and Soul, which has a professional, if you get the audio version, Marriage of Sense and Soul is a lovely little book by Ken Wilber. The audio version is fantastic because the professional reader is just so good. Like, that guy's voice I could listen to forever. It's a lovely little book about this, really, about the problem of collapsing quadrants and invalidating one. And one way to look at it is like, it's just not your area of expertise. Like, somebody who's, in objective sciences doesn't get to say what the experience of joy is, but they can identify dopamine. And somebody who's a poet doesn't really have any expertise on talking about brain chemistry. Like, it's not their area of expertise. So sort of stick to your area of expertise,
There's a way in which the categories we use force people to blur their areas of expertise. I was just watching a really good documentary on the cascading tipping points of the ecosystem. This guy was walking us through it. It's, the warming this and the mist is melting and the biodiversity collapse, and this will cause
fucked.
Right. So yeah, you're like, okay, we're doomed. I'm like, that's definitely happening. And it's going faster. All right. So he talks for 20 minutes, and the interviewer, because the topic is climate change, at the end, the interviewer says, well, what can be done? How do we socially transform ourselves in order to take this into account? This guy doesn't know anything about that. He spent his whole life devoted to the ecosystem. And now, because it's technically the same issue, they want him to answer the social question. All he can say is, I don't know, people should protest more. Maybe it'll build up into something. But that's not his area of expertise. And he was called to pretend it was his area of expertise because it's nominally under the same umbrella.
Yeah. And this is... I just wanted to reiterate the whole complex systems thing that's emerging as more of a okay, we need to start, the era of the expert is past in the eyes of certain current words, whatever. Okay, so expertise is great for depth, but there's sure. So there's breadth and then there's depth. And so breadth is sort of jack of all trades, master of none, more like myself. I dabble in a lot of different things, but I couldn't tell you extensive blah, blah, blah. It's more about Ken Wilber is one of the people that one of the rare people that has done both, extensive research deep into one subject, and then extensive research deep into another subject. And then over the course of 30 years, linking them all together. That's kind of rare that you'll find someone that's dedicated to doing that. Most people, it's either breadth or depth. We need to sort of synthesize things. And this is where the complex systems theory thing sort of comes into play, is understanding how all of these little details fit together, but also understanding the intricacy of each detail is incredibly necessary. And I think that the sort of call to have someone who knows deeply and is an expert in climate change, he doesn't have to know about the sociological component, but he needs to be aware of the fact that the sociological component is necessary for understanding the system as a whole. And,
Sure.
you know, having like, we need to like start, you know, having these embodiments of like multiple perspectives coming in, even if one person doesn't hold multiple perspectives themselves. I think like, you know, in the Spiral Dynamics book, which I have not finished yet, they talk about what does integral leadership look like. Sometimes it looks like someone who is very, very immersed in one particular stage, but they're expert at that stage, and they are like a manifestation of the healthiest possible way that that stage can show up, or that type can show up, or that specific line of development can show up. And like, they lead in conjunction with like other people who have different talents that balance that, you know, like you have, you know, the true diversity is like complementary diversity, much like how we see in the ecosystem when it's running effectively, is like this plant gets rid of this thing so that like this plant can grow, and then this plant helps the soil so that this other plant can grow, and the mushrooms ensure that like the plants are all talking to each other, and humans need to start working like that, you know.
And, you know, true integral leadership, you have to answer the questions: who should lead whom, to do what, in what context, for what purpose first. Right. And then you can, but then within that, once you determine who that part is, and then, but then within that, you know, that person, whoever that is, whether it's a CEO or whether it's, you know, somebody on the board of trustees or what have you, the leader of a community, they need to understand the different perspectives that need to come to bear for a truly integral approach. They need to at least be integrally informed. So they might be shit at emotional intelligence, but they need someone on their team then that can read the room. And, you know, and, you know, they like the person, you know, in the climate change, you know, thing that you're watching, they need to partner with somebody who understands how to motivate humans in a clean way to change their behavior. As a side note, a report just came out. You know how the tobacco industry knew for 40 years that it caused cancer and they denied it? They had scientists who, you know, behind the scenes. Apparently, something was just leaked that the petroleum industries, I don't know what you call them. Anyway, they commissioned scientists 30 years ago, I think. They've been aware for a long time. And so like they had a team of scientists go, yeah, here's what's going to happen. And, you know, and this was 30 or 40 years ago. And that was just leaked. So, and I think 20 years ago, our militaries were gaming what would happen if the polar ice caps melted. Like everything from who's going to, you know, we've already mapped out whose territory it is up there with China, Russia. You know, there's like 5 or 6. I think Denmark has some stake and so we've already war gamed. We've already gamed for what's going to happen with the resources under the polar ice cap. And apparently a quarter of the world's petroleum reserves are up there.
That's interesting relative to identity. Which is that, I mean, there are people who've done it and there are people who haven't, which is we're not really up to speed on where we're at. We go, oh, yeah, I get this. But do we really get it? Do we really get like this is what's happening? In the same way, you know, does a man really get that he's a man? Does a Japanese woman really get that she's a Japanese woman? There's a sense in which we're living out these things that we haven't necessarily cognitively or consciously gotten up to speed on, and we'd have to get up to speed on them in order to take them in new directions and or disidentify with them into some greater consciousness.
Yeah.
Well, this is where I think that like archetypal intelligence sometimes will show up is like, I get this all the time where it's like, I get this, I understand it. I don't know how to explain it to you because like my sort of like intuitive intelligence or my archetypal intelligence or my emotional intelligence gets it, but my sort of analytical intelligence does not quite get it yet, you know? And so like because there are so many different versions of what it means to understand something, and to understand something holistically is not the same as to understand, like just because you explain something to someone doesn't necessarily mean you understand it holistically. You might understand it
I'm
on
way
certain
smarter
levels.
than I sound.
Me too. Shit.
I sound way smarter than I am.
Me too. Hashtag both and.
Yeah, I was
I
gonna say
am both really smart and super dumb.
I can't even say me too anymore. I have to say I also feel that way. Anyway.
Oh, geez,
so
Rick.
I think it's important also that we distinguish between disidentification and dissociation.
Yep.
And one is a kind of bypass, and the other is a healthy objectification of the thing. It's like, I want to bring up the ethnic thing one more time. I had somebody. Oh, by the way, I'm with was it Cthulhu? Speaking of H.P. Lovecraft,
yeah,
it's the
Cthulhu.
I'm with Cthulhu. No lives matter.
I saw that one. I
had I'm
Cthulhu 2021 or whatever.
Totally. That's my favorite thing to do around election time. I post campaign posters for Cthulhu. Anyway, so I had this friend of mine, or an acquaintance of mine, I guess, who I used to run a quantum masculine group with. We co-ran it, and I left, and sort of my first communication from this guy was about after about 6 months, he posted something on his wall, and it was like right when Black Lives Matter's protests were beginning, and he was denouncing his whiteness, right? And the idea was you would post this thing. It was one of those like when you tag somebody and then they're supposed to also, and he tagged me like denounce your whiteness, and I was like, first of all, I've never identified as white. Like, I'm Irish and American Indian. And second of all, like, fuck you for tagging me in this thing. Like, first of all, just don't, like, I decline to participate in that, whether it's pass this on and you'll have good luck, or, like, what's your, like, I don't do the copy paste to your wall thing. I just decline. Like, I'm like, social media is bad enough as it is. I don't need a more of a campaign like that. But I was also just sort of, like, I was pissed off that he thought he projected onto me that I was somehow identified. Like, whenever somebody asks me over the phone for a government thing or to identify ethnicity, I'm always like a little confused and uncomfortable for a minute. I'm like, well, for like 10 seconds, I'm like there's no box for Irish and American Indian, right? Or Blackfoot. And I don't even relate to it like that. Like, I don't care. It means certain things about me genetically, but I just don't relate to it. I don't know what my point was there, but
first of all, I think they had it right in the 1920s. The Irish are not white. But second of all, I think there's a really important distinction between evaluations and identities. And there's a sense in which people think they're not being problematic if they have the evaluation of a category, which is the currently popular evaluation, right? Like, if I'm, like, I love Black people, I'm like, is that better because you said the word love? Or if someone's like, oh, it's problematic to appear white right now, so I'm denouncing whiteness. And so I'm making the correct evaluation. I'm making the evaluation that I think is the current social appropriate valuation, but I'm still using the same cognitive category. So it doesn't really matter whether you're making the positive or the negative evaluation. Just like you can fuck up a kid's ability to develop healthy self-esteem with negative or positive reinforcement if it's the wrong kind. So we have to tease apart the evaluation from the categorization or something like that.
Yeah.
Oh, I was listening the whole time, by the way, because I have Bluetooth headphones.
Yeah, you also agree that the Irish aren't really white?
Well, here's the thing about like whiteness, and here's where it gets confusing. And it's funny because like I learned this. So
they're pink. They're like pink.
Okay.
You're coming to take our jobs, man.
You guys are silencing me as a Black woman right now. by talking over me, you misogynist pigs.
I'd like to own my identity as a misogynist pig.
Jason knows I'm joking, and he still rolled his eyes just to make a point. I love it.
So,
what were you getting at, Scout?
Yeah, well, here's the thing with like whiteness and why I think the general conversation is so confusing is because, Topola Jordan Peterson here, like, what do you mean when you say that? Like, do you mean the skin color? Do you mean like specific cultural? Because that's the thing, is that like whiteness is a cultural narrative. It's not an ethnicity. Black is a cultural narrative. It's not an ethnicity. And like an ethnicity is like if you look at like Jewish and the Jewish identity, that like it's a multi-ethnic cultural group. There are different ethnicities of Judaism, like of Jewish people, and then there's also the Judaism, the actual religion. That, like, where did Jason go? There's different layers to the identity itself. So if you're identifying someone as white, you're sort of like, it's a little bit reductionist to be like, oh, renounce your whiteness. Like I would, if I was white and someone said that to me, I would be like, which aspect of my whiteness do you want me to renounce? Do you want me to cut my skin off? Do you want me to say that I don't agree with the narrative of what it means to be white? Or what do you want me to do here? Because it's multi-layered, and like people think that whiteness is not multi-layered because they're identifying whiteness as a cultural narrative. And then when people get defensive, the reason they get defensive is because they identify whiteness as like a physical phenomenon that they can't control. So they're like, you want me to stop being what I physically can't control. And then the other people who are saying denounce your whiteness, they're like, no, we want you to denounce a specific cultural narrative, which is also has to do with Christianity, with colonization, with class and socioeconomic status. So it's a very like what people mean when they say whiteness or blackness or whatever, like, because when people like say talk to me like as a black person and they talk about blackness, I am always never really sure what they're identifying about me, because I've never identified with the cultural narrative of being black, which is there's a cultural narrative of being black that has to do with the mythology of struggle. There's also one that has to do with the mythology of being an outsider. There's also one that has to do with the mythology of being like strong and powerful. So there's so many different narratives that are collected within this one label, and people don't really specify what they mean. Like, what do you want me to specifically denounce in this narrative, and why? What do you see about this narrative that's problematic? And if you don't go into detail there and you're just saying whiteness is bad, you're really not helping dismantle what you feel needs to be dismantled.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's an activity that engages in the same level of thinking. It's racist,
right?
It also brings in original sin. It's like, hey, guess what? My grandparents they were poor potato farmers who came over from, like, my great grandfather actually came over from Ireland, and on my maternal side, my grandfather,
refugee from genocide.
Like, I'm sorry, I am not going to feel fundamentally like, I'm not going to like bringing in the mythology of original sin, which I rejected a long time ago. I believe in universal innocence. Like, it's biblical to say, well, the sins of the father. Not really. Right. And by the way, my family never owned slaves, so I'm not going to, I'm just not going to buy into that. I'm a racist, or I'm guilty because I'm white, or because I'm male. Right. Another thing that really bothered me was this thing that was going around. There was a trend going around a couple of years ago in transformational communities where men would apologize to women for all the sins that men had committed, previously, like part of the patriarchy, whatever. And I was like, yeah, I haven't violated anybody. So, and it just seemed like, I've stretched a few, but I haven't violated it.
You've single-handedly fixed my daddy issues. Thanks, man.
God. And there was, and every time I saw a couple of guys do videos, and I had trouble, and I'm sure a lot of deeply traumatized women, like, it speaks into that, like that's where, it's that I'll call it a market. It's that like that's the audience that
it
speaks
is
to.
marketing.
I don't really want to.
Ultimately,
I think it kind of it is a little bit, even if it's well intended. Yep. And the guys who actually watched the video, I was like, ugh, like it just felt off to me. Yep. And not just because they were taking responsibility for things that they had not participated in, or maybe they had. I don't know. I didn't know them. But they were doing it as a collective, like we apologize on behalf of men. And there was a female version of it too. And it's like, okay, so like an open letter to men apologizing. But I'm like, I'm just not buying into that. And again, it's an original sin. Like it really does come from the same mythology as Christianity. Like we're born as sinners. I don't buy that. And I don't think we should.
And it's funny because like the whiteness piece, the sort of narrative that, you know, when I speak to like people who are into social justice and who are like specifically like anti-racists that like, you know, so there's anti-racists that like I see where they're coming from and I agree with them on certain points. And there's anti-racists that I vehemently critique. And so the ones that I like specifically agree with are the ones who understand when they say whiteness, what I understand what they mean is a specific cultural narrative that relies on superiority in relation to other groups, and it feeds an exploitative sort of like classist sort of structure that ultimately does not benefit anyone. And so like they use more particular language. They talk about sort of waspiness, like WASP culture, and it's a specific type of culture that is honestly more based on like a Christian narrative, which encompasses the original sin thing. And so like understanding that like the waspiness and then the anti-racism are both embodying that structure, and they're just calling it different things, you know, like the anti-racists call it whiteness, the WASPs call it, what do they call it? Like original sin. But it's like this thing has taken on a different linguistic structure and has like sort of like adapted to and conformed to a different, you know, like it acts as if it's battling a different monster, but it's actually not. It's battling a monster that is internal. It's shame. That's what it is. It's an externalization of shame that's taken on a different language structure.
And it's a weaponization.
And it's a weaponization.
It's part of that weaponization you're talking about. And so, and I also like believe it or not, my biggest complaint with it is it's just imprecise. Like it's inaccurate.
Right.
And so like I've got a friend who's really, it really like it's just over, you know, like the oversimplification you talked about, Scott. But I had a friend who was deeply steeped in integral theory, by the way, like, and one of the most brilliant guys I met. And it turns out he's a racist, like full on racist. And I was like, dude, you know about spiral dynamics? Like it's far more precise to talk about different stages of moral, like the things he was talking about culturally. Like Scott was saying, it's not about, you know, it's not about ethnicity. It's about like these cultural, like, you know, it's a cultural narrative thing. And I'm like, and that's more precise than ethnicity. But I think spiral dynamics is even more precise than that. He was full on like, nope, it's because they're black. And I was like, dude. And the only thing I could finally reconcile with, like, he must have had some deep trauma around, like, I knew somebody who was Jewish, and he's in his 80s now, early 80s. And he used to get beat up going to grade school. He would get beat up by black kids in Philadelphia every morning because he was Jewish. Like he was like Jews at the time were lower than, like, you know, blacks were higher in the order of in Philadelphia at the time.
Which is a thing.
So he was like, point that out.
I'm just wanting to point out that the structure.
It's a real place.
No, I'm just trying to point out that like the structure of supremacy, the sort of racial supremacist structure. Some like we focus on when it's white people, but like that's a context that may not be as people consider systemic, but it's still a phenomenon that happens where like black people are at the top of the social structure and they dominate and control. You know, in the sense like it's a thing. It happens. We don't talk about it, but it happens.
So I'm sorry for interrupting. Like, no, it's fine. I don't care. My conclusion with this guy was like, because he was aware of more precise models, but he was fixated on ethnicity. The only thing I I could reasonably conclude was he must have had, he was, small and he was like 5'6", very, very thin. He was so small in stature. We lived together for a few months in the same communal household. He remarked to my girlfriend that he was impressed with how much I went out of my way to not influence. Like walking down the hall, I would, get out of his way because, I'm 5'11" and 200 pounds. Heavier right now because of the pandemic stuff. But at the time, like my natural weight is 200 pounds and 5'11" and 3/4. So like he had remarked to that. So I can only, like, it's a fantasy. It's just something I invented. I made up. I'm guessing, projecting, whatever. That he was just deeply traumatized by it because he wouldn't recognize that there's, even though he was aware of them and deeply schooled in them, he would rejected more precise models. And I don't know if he ever.
I think there's always been an element of physical intimidation in some parts of white against black prejudice. There's an interesting, for me, a couple interesting aspects of this discussion. I think it is in large part a conflation problem. You're right. Like, it's a lack of precision. It's a bit like I shot everyone downtown because somebody pissed me off. Like, I'm just not really hitting the target of what the thing is. Like you were saying, Scout, there's a whole bunch of different facets and narratives that are interwoven together. And if we're not distinguishing them, there's a very low chance that we're actually going to be responding to the part that we actually think is problematic or virtuous. But the other things I was thinking about around this, the playful use of Irish as not white, because that's an interesting way of thinking about the fact that what we call white is to a large extent a social construct, in that some people who we definitely think are white now were treated as if they weren't white not very long ago. And that, I think, tells us two things. One is that all ethnicities are cultivated into existence over time, right? The Spanish didn't fall out of the sky. They were bred to be the Spanish over thousands of years. Yep. And then there's also this specific way that ethnicity functions within modernity, let's say, which is that the class structure kind of defends itself by inventing an ethnicity that ostensibly gets the benefits of the class structure, but usually doesn't really get those benefits, but it's kind of a shield, right? That the winners in capitalism have white folks as a buffer and as the people who define the issue, and everybody else has to respond to that in a similar way that the Chinese have the Han, right? I saw a very interesting study that said, like, most people in China who identify as Han Chinese are not genetically Han Chinese. So it's a kind of cultivated ethnicity that people like to identify with, and you have to enter into this discourse about whether you are or not in that group. Meanwhile, the power structure continues as usual, protected by that whole discourse.
It's like the greatest fucking red herring ever created, this race structure, or caste system thing, and it's been going on for ever. We just have different ones because we have different nations and time has passed. But ultimately, there is a repetitive sort of historical, there's a historical pattern of sort of hierarchy that is justified because it ultimately, it's not a justifiable hierarchy. Natural hierarchies don't need to justify themselves, and they're also not static. But static hierarchies need to justify themselves in order to maintain themselves, because a static hierarchy is not natural. And what you need to do is you need to come up with some sort of reason, some sort of story. Oh, well, these are the people and this is why. And it's weird because the attack on the sort of whiteness thing is a story too. It's oh, see, historically these people get benefit and that's why they're on top and blah blah blah, and it sort of weirdly reinforces itself in this way that I don't think is beneficial to challenging it. It's weird.
As a real gritty example of what you both just said, 30 years ago when I was in prison, the very racially and I never bought into it, but it was there's Hispanics and there's whites and there's blacks, and there would be certain alliances, but there's certain things that are verboten. And I was in one prison where you weren't even supposed to, as a white person, you weren't even supposed to use a salt shaker after a black person did. Right now, some prisons forced you to, like, they did away with, you can sit wherever you want to sit, like in the order you came in is where you sit next. And so they did away with a lot of, but I always thought it was stunning. I was like, hey, we're not enemies. The dudes up on the catwalk with the AR-15s are the enemies. Like, do you get how they're playing us? And right. It didn't, like it didn't have much purchase because people were mostly at a red stage of development in terms of spiral dynamics. So, and I didn't have that model at the time. But I mean, I got heat for playing. My pinochle partner was black, and I just said, "Hey, I don't play those games. I'm just not." Sorry, I'm not. I'm just not. I'm not participating in that. And I got a couple of mad dog stares, but when they realized I didn't care, I wasn't going to be easily manipulated. It really went away. But to me, whether it's everybody laugh, like I imagine a lot of people at the top are, the faceless or people who are at the Davos retreat. They're all like, ha, 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 ha.
They literally don't have faces.
Yeah. Right. Have you seen Bill Burr's bit about population control? Like, I assume everybody flew private here. Yes, I know what we'll do for population control. We'll expose people when they go through airports to low levels of reading, the body scanners, and then all the water. And he does this really creepy bit about, there's a room of old white dudes who are all,
right.
Oh my gosh.
And it's funny too, because it's like, ultimately my sort of like belief, I'm going to sound like a total Marxist when I say this, which is hilarious because you both probably know that I'm not a Marxist, but like ultimately it comes down to resources and controlling resources. So sure. Like, well, because that's sort of like what the dominant value system has to do with, controlling and maintaining resources, I would say. Like, we value resources more than we value, we see human life as like a means to an end to make sure that like there's resources, and the sort of like rivalrous nature, I think, of our dynamics on a macro scale have to do with, are we safe? Like, is my body safe, or is my tribe safe? Because if my tribe's safe, my body's safe, and like that sort of thing. And it's not past the point of like, okay, is the planet in harmonious equilibrium is not really on most people's minds. Like, they don't see that as
sure.
We don't all have the same goal. And, I don't think that's ever really going to happen. But, the resources,
no,
go for it.
Well, I love grounding stuff in daily experience. So a few years ago I was in San Francisco, and every time I go to a Starbucks, the cream would be empty, and I started tracking it like dead empty, like not enough for the next person. And I would always, if like after I was done with it, if there wasn't enough for the next person, I would take it up to the counter. Like, took me 10 seconds, right? And at first I thought maybe it's just the Starbucks, like they're that clientele. So Pete's Coffee, which was like the more hippie, more progressive, right? Same numbers. I tracked it for like 6 months. It was like 4 or 5 out of 10 times I would go, it would be dead empty. And at first I thought it's because they just didn't give a shit about the next person. And then I realized I was giving them way too much credit. They don't even consider the next person. They weren't thinking beyond their, because I started observing people at the counter where they put cream and sugar, and they're like they look so addicted to the like putting the sugar in, like they were sort of zoned out. They just looked like zombies. I was like, yeah, I was giving them too much credit. It wasn't they considered the next person and said fuck them. It's that they didn't even occur to them that there was somebody after them. It was just their little experience.
Yeah.
So I think, thinking about like what's my impact on the global ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
Come on.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about the salt shaker thing. The notion of race and kind of policing these boundaries between people, and the way we think about distinctions relative to disempowerment, because there are a lot of distinctions that go on that are disempowering. Right. So that if we see like, oh, this was the black bathroom in the old baseball stadium, that makes us very suspicious that was probably a disempowering distinction. On the other hand, if I went down to a baseball game and there was a special bathroom for me, I might feel, oh, that's pretty good. I'm special. The distinction would register in me with a positive valence. Right. And Nietzsche did a lot of thinking about, how healthy we are, how much self-esteem we have relative to how we're able to treat distinctions as positive. And that doesn't mean there aren't disempowering distinctions, but we do have some leeway in terms of either assuming that anytime I'm distinguished, I'm being devalued, versus the fact that I could interpret that as an increase of my value.
Well, that's a particularly, I think, postmodern, that's one of the shadows of the postmodern experience, is like because people who have experienced distinctions in society have been, so like that's the whole like structuralism leading to post-structuralism thing that I think that then leads to critical theory. So like that sort of like history of philosophy, I think personally is really important to understanding why social justice is the way it is because like structuralism presupposed that these distinctions are inherent in nature, and the hierarchies are like due to there being superiority. And then post-structuralism questions that and goes like, wait, so why do we distinguish this the way we distinguish it? And what, like, where does that come from? All of that stuff. And then that is where critical theory comes into play. But most people don't actually know that it comes from a genuine desire to understand the categorizations that we make and how beneficial they are. That was more structuralism's job. We get caught in the critical aspect of it and like, oh, okay, so then we've come to determine that boxes are bad. We've come to determine that all distinctions come from an oppressive space because we sort of cut critical theory off from its mother, which is structuralism. What is the benefit of categorization? Why does it serve us? How does it serve us? That sort of thing. So I think that plays a role in what you're saying.
Yeah, there's an element of, it's very easy to be skeptical of privilege, but different kinds of privileges are possessed by different kinds of people, and privilege can also teach you things. And I think, right, my assumption, my imaginary situation where there's a special bathroom just for me, and I can interpret that as a wonderful improvement of my status, that comes out of a lot of privilege that I've had, right? I've grown up, white, male, not starving to death, competent at most things, pretty well liked, right? That's a pretty sweet spot in the existing society. But it's taught me that I have the option of interpreting things as if they were in my favor, right? But that's something you have to learn to some degree.
Yeah.
I had a girlfriend who was getting her PhD in theology, and she went to speak at a panel on privilege and on race, and she was the only white girl there, and it became pretty clear. And it was a panel on diversity. It became pretty clear that it was really a white against black thing, and most people there were black. And she said, "Hey, if you really like, the smart thing to do is to align with white privileged people who will be your champions to sort of help you." And was not well received, by the way, because they still had this us against them sort of approach. Whereas, I thought it was brilliant. And it didn't help that she was.
And she's right.
She's also, yeah, totally.
Just strategically speaking, like bringing all of the emotions out of it.
Yep, totally. She nailed it. Our part of our sort of point of friction, where she kept bringing up how privileged I was, and I was like, and she thought I was saying there's no such thing as privilege. I was like, no, my point is, so what? like if you go, well, I'm not privileged, or you hate people, like there's a mindset there where I said, yeah, she thought about me being privileged because I'm white. I'm like, sure. And also because I'm 6 feet tall, and also because I'm above average intelligence, and also because I'm because my voice is in a certain range where people actually, like, there's studies done on, where your voice is and how people are influenced by voice tone. I'm like, yeah, so what though? Like, I see people use it as an excuse, like, oh, the man's keeping me down, I'm not privileged enough, or like self-flagellation, like, oh, I'm so privileged, and they go into white guilt about it. I'm like, so what? Like, it just doesn't, to me. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm saying, yeah, and then people talk all the time about pretty privilege, especially with women. Like, there's,
I'm ugly and I'm proud.
You don't look like a square sponge. But I do see the yellow patch in your hair, so maybe there's a.
I think again, this is an area where an attitudinal shift would allow intersectionality and privilege to be really useful concepts in an expanded way, right? Like you're saying, register of voice and height. There's so many dimensions that come together in a network to make an identity, and each identity gains certain privileges in certain contexts from their particular network of variables. And if we could appreciate it in that more expanded sense, there's a really rich conversation that I think a lot more people could buy into and appreciate.
And the way I've internalized it and applied it to my own life is, and I don't think about it as privilege, but for a long time I was like, I didn't want to be like, I never wanted to be the guy on stage or the guy who, and the books I'm writing right now, the next year or two, I'm going to have to do media tours, and I finally embraced that. But for years I was like, no, I don't, because I don't want that. I don't care about it. It doesn't, like, I don't seek an audience or followers or, but I realized that I really shouldn't be the guy behind it. Like, I shouldn't be the one writing and develop, because I am privileged enough to be in this body with this voice, with and that I should use that in service of my spiritual purpose of accelerating the evolution of consciousness on the planet. Like, it's more about, like, it's how can I use it to serve people, and
you're too awesome not to be saving the world.
That was the original intention of bringing privilege into the social justice conversation. Like, I remember when I was a teenager and the social justice movement was first starting to take off, it made a whole lot more sense than it does now. Like, the primary goal of talking about social justice was to notice where sort of certain types of power in society collect, and how to use that to make life more positive for everyone, and I wrote a piece on this like maybe a couple of months ago. It's called "Should We Be Checking Our Privilege or Thanking It?" We can link to it, I guess, in like maybe the description when we put this up. But like, it talks about stages of development and bringing in the sort of dynamics necessary for change, which is something that I'm also reading about in the Spiral Dynamics book, which I think is really super important. Of like, okay, in order for like, the reason why people have the values that they have, it's not arbitrary. It's like, it's related to what their life conditions are. That's not something that is like super talked about. So like, someone who like, in prison, Jason was talking about, in prison, most people are at a red stage of development. Why? Not because they're idiots. It's because they're in prison. They need to survive.
Well,
how they survive is like.
Also, that's kind of how they got put in prison, though.
There's a bit of a self-selection.
That is true. Yeah. That's a fair point. I mean, but prison isn't necessarily an encouraging environment for developing someone out of that.
I have it. You actually regress to beige in prison because it's daily survival.
Sure.
And so I have it. Like, red is, might is right, power, like, so that's more like gangs or an armed robbery or, beating someone up to take their money. Or like, that's a red expression. You don't really like the supervision is so intense, especially the way they're building prisons now. that it really is, or like there isn't much room for red. You're right, Scout. There isn't room for, evolution.
Development.
They're not.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're not therefore evolving to blue and conventional. They're regressing to like, how do I survive day to day, moment to moment?
Yeah.
What do I
perhaps
trade,
not the most perhaps not the most precise example I could have used, but thank you for
how many self-rolled cigarettes can I trade for postage stamps? Like this.
This is perverse,
right?
Because the prisons have a unique opportunity to be developmental agencies in the society, right? Like we're going to take people who, for whatever reason, true or false, we think, this person might be problematic. We're going to keep them in a special place for a while, right? That could be a training facility. It could be an encouragement facility. It could be a developmental facility of some kind. And yet it has an anti-developmental effect, right? Like you're saying, pushing people down to red, pushing people below red. It's doing
because
the
it's easier to
opposite of improving individuals.
It's easier to exploit people who aren't developed.
And control.
So why would they develop? Why would they develop people? Because then it doesn't serve this greater sort of like structure that, in order for that structure to exist. This is what I was talking about with the hierarchies, like the unnatural hierarchies, like being static. In order for them to continue being static, certain, like things like the way that prison works, the way that the schooling system works, the way that the medical system works, they need to be exactly how they are in order to maintain the hierarchy the way that it is, because the hierarchy is not allowed to be fluid like it would be if it were a natural hierarchy.
35 years ago, California removed any language out of the penal code and their operating SOPs, and operation manuals about rehabilitation. Like they just removed it as an outcome or a goal in prisons. I took it upon myself because I realized when I got there, I didn't fit in really well because I had been slapped on the wrist a couple of times. But I was in there for my third felony right before the 3 strikes law in California. Like the 3 strikes law passed right after my third conviction. But I hadn't been sent to prison the first 2 times. In fact, the judge said, Mr. McClain, how come you're not in prison yet? And I said, I'm not sure, Your Honor. He goes, where you're going this time. But I realized very quickly that I didn't fit in. And then the right people handed me the right books at the right time. I got into Tony Robbins. I got into bodybuilding. I developed myself and cleared a lot of my trauma out in prison. Like I self-evaluated, developed. So I had and then right after that, I got out of prison and almost fell into an NLP practitioner certification training. So, by the time I was 25, I had experienced more tools for developing myself than most people may ever have in their lifetime. I was an NLP master practitioner by the time I was 26. So, I did take it on as like, well, I'm not coming back here. So what do I need to do to make sure I don't come back here? That was clear out my traumas, my beliefs about myself, my parental imprints. Like there was a, work on my own identity and just my mindsets around all of it. So it is an opportunity. I've had people say, well, wouldn't you like to go volunteer time? I'm like, nope, I don't want anything to do with prisons. No, thank you. But that's like not what I want to do,
But that's another thing too, is like, is I think that speaks to the complexity of development itself, like, because you hear the 2 general most common belief systems are bootstraps and society has to fix them, and like neither are really true, because like what I heard you say was like you ended up in prison, which was like a consequence of stealing cars, and then you could have prison is not exactly a place that encourages development, yet a lot of people who, like, you hear stories similar to your own, you're not like an anomaly necessarily, it's just like it's necessarily rare, where like people do use prison as an opportunity to develop themselves, but whether or not they do is so it's like there's luck, there's intention, there's what stage of development you were at when you ended up in prison. There's like, you know, there's all of these different factors that come into play. And then like people will often only focus on like 1 or 2 or 3 if they're like really smart, you know, like
and then there's the other mentality, which is a leopard can't change its spots.
Right. Yeah. The sort of deterministic bullshit.
Yeah.
And there are ways in which the existing power structure, whatever we want to call that, is served by the simplicity
You mean the occult cabal?
of the options, right? You go, well, it's society, or it's your fault, or nothing will happen. And these options constrain what we can do, what we can think of, the kinds of solutions that we can implement. And who does that advantage? Who did the apparent options advantage?
Yep. Yeah, everything affects everything else. And like anything being left out will affect how accurate your perception of any given phenomena that you're choosing to focus on. You know, as soon as you choose to focus on something, this is why I have ADHD. As soon as you choose to focus on something, all the other things drop out of your awareness. And so you got to remember that those things. What
were we talking about?
Yeah, I normally don't tell everyone that, but I thought I'd share.
Do you remember what you were talking about?
Here's the thing. Yeah, I was talking about how ADHD parallels this sort of like phenomenon, like this macro scale phenomenon of like every time we focus on something, everything else falls away. But like what's interesting about you know, this more integral way of thinking is that like it's like, okay, well, don't focus on one thing too much, because everything else matters. Everything else informs that one thing you're focusing on. And if you don't also focus on the things surrounding that thing, you miss out on so much, you know?
So many things.
So yeah, it's all the things.
Which is a technical term. One of my favorite things that I guess I'll call it the Integral Institute or the Integral Community produced was integral life practice, you know, which is like interior, exterior, communal, you know, the I, we, and it, you know, is one way to put it, self, nature, and self, nature, and community. But, you know, like looking at the areas in which you're underdeveloped and focus on increasing your level of development there. I still do have a bone to pick with, like Ken Wilber shifted his outcomes to getting, you know, the world to 10% integral, to getting the world to 10% integrally informed, which I think first of all, it was like, all right, sure, it's an easier benchmark to get. I understand, but I think I think well, and that's, you know, and I think that also it leads into the problem of cognitive understanding, but not emotional and moral development. But I love the integral life practice because it's like exercise your body and have your nutrition right, and engage in mindful meditation practices, and be engaged in community and to develop those, you know, those areas. And I think this is exactly what I was talking about before when I brought up the whole like prison and the developmental is like, so like because like we're so concerned with survival at the end of the day, like that is arguably one of the most powerful part, like for most people, it's the most powerful part of you that's driving you is like, oh, am I going to die or not? Like, that's the whole thing. And like, whether or not we develop, you know, past certain stages, or whether or not we gain more facility with, you know, how many perspectives or how many different types we can embody or what have you, is like largely dependent for a lot of people on how intrinsic that value system is to their current life conditions and how they survive within it, you know? And so like people who are really vehement about making like, oh, the environment, like we have to do this or else the environment, like they're absolutist in the way that they come across, because the absolutism is the structure that
they believe is necessary for their survival. Same with like the pluralism. Oh, if I don't accept all of the people, like then bad things will happen. So it's you know, it's largely dependent on like what you think is necessary for the survival of either self or humanity, or both, I would say.
There was a point at which I thought the free market could solve a lot of things. Now we don't have a free market, you know, but I was like fundamentally, I mean, like where I reside is anarcho-capitalism, but that only actually works at orange or above in spiral dynamics, emotionally and morally. Like you have to, red entering capitalism is a nightmare. And so that's why libertarianism doesn't really work. That's why anarcho-capitalism doesn't really work. It's nice in theory, but there's all these people below orange that make it a
you would need
nightmare.
A ton of socialism to produce the people who were capable of being libertarians.
Totally. So what's hilarious?
Oh my God! So I need to write that down.
So what's hilarious is I just took a political. I don't get involved in politics because it's all a nightmare. But I saw a new. I like to take tests to assess. And what was hilarious was they choose which. They're like, well, based on your answers to these 50 questions, here's the candidate in your area that you would most resonate with, and here's the political party, and they rank them like 1 to 10, right? My number 1 party was libertarian. My number 2 party was like American Socialists or something.
I love that.
I was like, oh my gosh! But there was nobody. The candidate that they projected for number 1. I think we agreed on like 20% of the things because it was just too many. There's all these. I was like, no. I think it's a real, and I think that there's most libertarians don't get, like, if they got spiral dynamics, it's like, hey, it's like nuclear weapons. You don't want to give nuclear weapons to somebody, a community at a red stage of development, because they'll use them, or like they won't use them as a deterrent. They're like, yeah, let's go blow those bastards up. And so, it's different to have a theological regime like Iran having nuclear weapons than it is, somebody like the United Kingdom being in possession of nuclear. I think it's a fundamentally different thing because of their center of gravity. I fucking lost it. I forgot.
It's absolutely essential to make those distinctions, and physical tools like nuclear weapons make it really obvious, but there's a lot of ways in which it goes on very subtly, which is like, hey, here we have a tool. This tool is a set of concepts relative to postmodernism and critical thought. And we're going to hand it off to some people who are at Amber. And then we're shocked when they use it as a team sports warfare mechanism.
Right. Exactly. Right. I actually got into not right after, but I think around 2006, I got into a discussion with somebody on some, some political bulletin board. It was a libertarian focused, and we were specifically talking about Iran and nuclear weapons. And the guy who was to the bone libertarian, he's like, well, if we can have them, they should be able to have them too. And I tried to explain spiral dynamics to him. I was like, look, they're at a different stage morally and emotionally, and here's how they're going to and so, and he just kept going back to the stupid two-dimensional version of it. Like, if we can have them, shouldn't they have them? I'm like, no. And not because we're better than them, but because of the predictable results of that kind of regime. It's like North Korea, them having, well, if they could have one actually accurately go anywhere. A
really difficult thing is like figuring out what way to try and explain spiral dynamics to a person at their level of development. And like, that's something I struggle with. Could be because I don't understand spiral dynamics as deeply as I need to in order to get to that level of being able to do that. But could also just be like, I don't know. What are your, like, I'm actually asking, I don't really you guys, want to. I'm asking you guys, like, what was that, Layman?
And like sometimes it's that you don't actually want to. You're like, do I really have to explain this to you? I'm like, maybe just fuck you, and I'll talk to people I get along with.
100%.
No, I need to be able to explain it. I need to be able to explain it to people for the purposes of like what kind of work I want to do in the world, which is like integral leadership, but like from a space of like, I want to work with people at different stages of development without being like, you need to be at a higher stage of development or you need to be at a later stage of development because of the thing we spoke to earlier. Sometimes it's better that the person's not. Sometimes it's better that the person is more immersed in an earlier stage of development and is just a healthy manifestation of that. But like, they might not understand where I'm coming from because it might seem, it's going to seem convoluted. It's going to seem convoluted to them. So how do I explain my intentions and purposes and whatnot at their stage? Like, you know, like if
there are translation skills, right? Like,
so what do I do? Just listen to me. I know what I'm talking about.
There's a limitation and there's a capacity, right? Like there are ways to get better, and people have to get way better at the downward assimilation and being able to adapt things that make sense to the linguistic and cognitive and social and emotional languages of all the different people. But in order to do that, we also have to be aware of where our emotions are and what the limitations are. There's this great movie called The Mothman Prophecies with Richard Gere. And it's like, so at one point he's encountering all this weird stuff that might be angels or devils or aliens or whatever. And it's kind of compelling, very realistic, but he goes to talk to an expert. And he says, look, some kind of entity is here and I don't understand it. And it's trying to communicate to me. And the expert says, have you ever tried to explain yourself to a cockroach? Right. So there is some kind of cutoff.
Dang, bro.
At which you're not going to be able to say things, right? And at each step in a developmental process, there's more and more limitation on what you could actually communicate. But that doesn't mean that we're anywhere near the limit of what we might actually be able to get across if we had more skill.
Sure. So I think, so Scout, your question was, how do I explain spiral dynamics to somebody at, lower, that was what you said. And
well, I want to make the question a little bit more expansive so that it's not centered around myself, so that it's more beneficial to the viewers. So like, I'd like to rephrase it if I can. Yeah,
please.
Yeah. Okay. So like, how do stages interact with one another, like different stages of development interact with one another, using, my personal example as not like an actual help me do the thing, but like as an example of, if we're going to have a more harmonious world, we can't just expect someone who is like very immersed in blue and the blue values work for them and they always have and they continue to. You can't expect that person to just like, hey, you should be integral now because I said so. Like, how do we interact as leaders, at later stages of development in a compassionate way and in like more of a shepherding way, but not in like we're not trying to reinforce these static hierarchies that we know don't work. We're trying to open the world to new ways of being and thinking, and we're trying to open people's minds to greater complexity without overwhelming them. So how do we interact with these earlier stages in a way that's both authentic and shepherding and also honoring of their perspective and their worldview?
So first of all, I'm going to address these in reverse order. What is authentic? What is authentic will depend on how much you've disidentified from all the things you think you are. And if like, once you've disidentified from all of it, what's authentic is what would best serve the situation in the moment. So it's not inauthentic to speak to their values.
Right.
Now, that's how we do it. We have to use like for me, the benefit of spiral dynamics is to have skillful means communicating and understanding people at a former or lower or more shallow stage of development, so that we can speak into them and then expand their world by offering, like, they feel validated enough to trust us enough that we can then say, and here's this other thing also. So I think that's how we do it, and there's a fine line between wanting to evolve faster, which is kind of an orange motivation, not an integral motivation. Integral motivation is kind of like, that's where they're at. I can, how do we create a more harmonious world? Well, let's get everybody to integral. It creates a more hospitable environment for everybody. But, we're not going to reach we may not even reach a critical mass. Like, think about it. Maybe in our major metropolitan areas, we might reach a critical mass at some point in our lifetimes. I'm kind of skeptical about that.
About the same moment that civilization is catastrophically destroyed.
Yeah, we're not going to avoid dystopia at this point. We're just going to have a highly intelligent dystopic reality.
We're going to have a very graceful collapse.
but to the question that you asked first, which I'm going to address, even though you relanguaged it, I think it's important to note for a lot of people.
No, it still stands.
Quit fucking trying to explain spiral dynamics to somebody at blue. Like, fucking stop it. Or orange. Quit it. Because nobody gives a shit, first of all. It's geeking out. Nobody really cares. They care about their values. They care about their world. Spiral dynamics is sort of behind a lot of things I do. I never talk about it because nobody cares. I use it for marketing. And it's funny, I went into a small company and I did some consulting for them around sales and marketing and building coaching packages for them. And I talked about, here's how to market to orange and green. They're very different things. For this, you want to market to connection and community. For this, you want to market to achievement and skills, like orange, green. And this woman, she's like, oh my God, I knew spiral dynamics and found it interesting, but didn't know it was useful for anything. But similarly, again, how do you explain it to somebody at a lower stage? You don't. Now, just like you can really only self-assess once you get to green. Like somebody at orange can't and people at green still confuse like my problem with the integral community, if there is such a thing, is they're not at integral. So it's my primary complaint. And a lot of them are pathological orange and they're really smart. So you don't until once, maybe somebody, because they'll just use it, they'll weaponize it, they'll use it for manipulation. Maybe green is where you can sort of introduce the model where it won't be abused. But before that, you just use skillful means to speak into their values. And then
it won't be abused, but it will be, they will be they'll immediately, the first thing that people, if they're pretty immersed with green, or if green values are their most important values, they'll be like, why is the stage on top of mine? The stage
there's some, I would say a few things about this.
Orange will be like, wait, what do you mean there's people better than me? I'm the best.
all of tier one. That's the nature.
Yeah, exactly. They're all going to be like that. And there's different specific ways to interact with each one of them. So it's hard to make a general comment. It's like you're dealing with green and you're like, this is a hierarchy of inclusion.
Right.
You're right at the top of this because you're more inclusive. And people who are suspicious of hierarchies are right at the top of the hierarchy I'm talking about. So there's that kind of stuff. But I think Jason's making an excellent point, is that general skill and just being infused with your own wisdom about it shows up in these different modes of communication where you don't have to actively figure out a way to language the content to them. But there are some, I think, general principles that are useful. I think there are ways to work out phraseologies that apply to multiple stages. And I often go back in my mind to a situation of talking to my cousin's midwife, very fundamentalist Christian woman, but I could talk to her about the Lord, which I meant a very abstract archetypal concept applicable to many systems. And she thought I was talking about Jesus. And then she could say things about Jesus that I could upscale to being about the archetype I was discussing. So there was a translation mechanism there.
That's exactly what I'm talking
certain
about.
Phraseology. I think there's also a way of approaching first through their values. I think Jonathan Haidt has an interesting example in one of his books about communicating with conservatives in America about the ecosystem, where if you start off saying, hey, the environment's important, they shut down immediately. right? But
Yeah.
if you say to them, look, America is the greatest country in the history of the world, and therefore we've got the greatest nature in the history of the world, and therefore we should be willing to sacrifice to look after what's great. They're like, okay, yeah, tell me more about your environmental proposal, because you led with a value that they understood.
Yeah.
And then the third thing is you can set up customs where the ambiguity and complexity is tolerable, like the role of the shaman in the ancient tribe, where the shaman saw more things, had more experiences than the average member of the village. And he couldn't really communicate that, but there was a custom which said you expect and acknowledge him to be incomprehensible to you in some regards. And that's very valuable. You should listen to him because you don't get what he's talking about. So there's the ways of languaging, there's ways of leading with values, but there's also ways of setting up social customs that make those exchanges a little easier.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense, because a lot of the, like, how I explain typology to people who tend to be like the type that they're like, I reject labels, or I don't like labels, is like, this is precisely what it's for. You realize where you limit yourself so that you can stop limiting yourself in those ways. So it'll be like, oh, society has encouraged you to behave a certain way, and then it tells you what role you fall into within those sanctions that society's given you. And if you're aware of them, you can like be conscious of how you can not let that stop you from being your authentic self or whatever, or like, you know.
I'm going to label you as one of those people who escapes from labels. You don't believe in the horoscope? That's very Sagittarius of you.
and it's definitely a
so
4
funny.
quality. She's unclassifiable. That's what.
No, that's so funny, because if you look at my astrology, like I do have a lot of heavy Sagittarian stuff, but it only, like, because of the system of astrology that I use, it only shows up in a specific context, and this is that context. People who see me like from the internet always assume I'm a fire sign. I'm not a fire sign. So that's the whole complexity level of like typology, is like, what's the context? How is it appropriate for me to focus on astrology right now? Or is there something else? Should I be focusing on just being present with you in the moment? Like, what actually serves? You know, sometimes being like, yeah, Sagittarius totally doesn't serve. Arguably, most of the time it doesn't. Especially in the like modern / postmodern.
When did you turn that guitar around? I didn't notice it happen.
I know, right? I've been staring at it for like 15 minutes going, when did that happen?
I have no idea what you guys are talking about.
Never mind.
It's been almost 3 hours, so we should be in our winding down phase here.
You took the words right out of my mouth. I gotta go.
The guitar went to sleep.
We lulled it to sleep. Hopefully, people stuck through this whole thing. I gotta go though. Jason McClain, evolutionarycompanies.com. Cheers.
Cheers.
Yeah,
See you guys next time, maybe.
I love our conversations.
Yeah, I'm having great fun with you too. It's fabulous.
Yeah.
Cheers.
See you soon.